Serious retired soldiers on Reddit, what was something that you saw or experienced that you never shared with anyone? The thing is, that war is so un-American. And what I mean by that is that day-to-day American life has been designed to shield us as much as possible from the dark truth of human existence. Things can be tough in America, but it's not like how things are in third world cesspools like Iraq and Afghanistan. In America we are taught to value life, and that life is sacred. We don't tolerate packs of hungry dogs wandering our streets, much less packs of hungry children. I can see how tormented our soldiers are when their modern values and perceptions meet the monstrosity of the ancient world. Americans tend to be optimistic and try to look for the good in people. This is not the way people look at things in many foreign countries. I lived in Africa for 6 years. I lived in a completely corrupt country. They had all the oil, gold, copper, uranium, hydropower and farmland they needed to be a first world nation. But instead the country was poor, starving and backwards. The inhumanity of the people towards each other was unbelievable. I asked an intelligent black guy over there if there was anything that could be done to fix that mess. He looked at me with a little bit of that contempt that Africans tend to have for idealistic white westerners and said, kill everyone and start over. The thing that will stick with me forever is this. Back in 2010 northwest of Sangwin, Afghanistan, I was the corpsman for my group of 4 Marines. We specialized in JTACs, guys who call in aircraft, and were supporting the Georgian army in creating a new patrol base point. We get to the area where the base is going to be built, sand walls FTW, and camp out in our trucks until the bulldozers finish building the walls and filling up HESCO barriers. Around the second day near noon we hear an explosion and see in the distance a large smoke cloud point. We radio to see if there were any friendly forces near that area, but no coalition forces were near us. We then mount up to go check it out, and as we near the site we see 2 adult figures running around a van that hit an IED. As we pull up there is a 6-passenger Afghan van that looks like it hit an IED. This van was demolished, charred, and the engine was on fire. As we dismount the 2 make adults run to us. This freaked us out cause they might be insurgents, but our interpreter was there and told us that they were brothers asking for help cause one of the brothers had 4 daughters in the van with them when they hit the IED. We rush to the van and there is still smoke everywhere, but we start pulling on the rear driver door and I can hear one of the daughters still screaming inside. As we pry the door open we look inside and I will never forget what I saw. Inside was all charred, smoke was still coming out of the van, and in the seats was what remained of the 4 daughters. 3 of the daughters were torn apart by the explosion with limbs and body parts everywhere. The 4th was still holding one of her sister's amputated hand, while her other hand was pressed on her side. The blast had amputated her lower left leg going up to her pelvis. She was trying to scream, but she was already losing too much blood, making her lose consciousness. We pulled her out, and I got to work trying to stop her from bleeding out, but I could only keep her alive for 15 more minimum. The father and uncle held her hand as she never woke up from losing consciousness. Me and my Marine started collecting the body parts of the other daughters, so the father and brother could bury their remains. Their ages were 4, 5, and 6. Fuck Afghanistan. Okay, so this is definitely going to make me out to be an asshole, but it happened, and it's not a story I share to anyone. I was in Iraq for 7 months doing convoy security. We would drive all over the country delivering supplies and personnel wherever we were ordered to. It wasn't uncommon for all the kids of smaller villages to run along the roadside asking for muffins or Gatorades or any other thing they could point at. First we would regularly throw snacks to them. It was cool seeing their smiling faces after they caught a chocolate muffin or a fruit punch Gatorade. We'd feel like Santa Claus winning the hearts and minds of the younger generations, ensuring they would never turn to terrorism. Winning the war on terror 1 muffin at a time. But of course things changed. Another unit had an accident and a couple kids got run over or hurt, basically trying to catch snakes being thrown to them. So our new standard of procedure was to not give out anything whatsoever in order to keep the kids from grouping around our vehicles as we drove through their towns. This didn't stop them from gathering, and it almost made them more desperate in their attempts to get anything from us. even asking for water, which was something they would actually reject when we were throwing snacks at them point. So we are rolling through the city at a painfully slow speed. Reports of IEDs being found nearby recently, coupled with all the civilians who lined the road, made us extra careful not to drive over anything or anyone that would compromise the safety objective of our mission. As I'm scanning the road and people ahead of me, I spot this adorable little Iraqi girl halfway hiding behind her father's leg as she stares at us with her big green eyes. She must have been around 4 or 5. I knew we weren't supposed to give them anything anymore, but my heart melted for her, so I handed my gunner a muffin and asked him to toss it to that little girl, and he did. Her father got this huge smile as he gave us a thank you wave, and the little girl, excited that she got a muffin, ran up the road to show another group of kids her snack when this boy, who had to have been at least 12, just shoved the sheet out of the little girl and snatches her muffin away. My whole truck was pissed. Little terrorist faker shoving a little girl not even half his size. I was livid as it was a very violent shove, and the little girl exploded into tears as she sat there in the dirt muffinless. As we continued to roll towards the group of kids, I handed my gunner my BIS bottle, a bottle of Gatorade that I would BIS into while driving, because we didn't stop for BIS breaks while on a mission, and told him to toss it to that same kid. It couldn't have been more perfect. As we got closer to the group, he turned to the trucks with his mouth full of muffin and started motioning for us to throw him something, so we obliged. He greedily ran away from the rest of the group of kids that were trying to wrestle the bottle from him. Being bigger than all of them, it wasn't much of a struggle, so as he's jogging away we see him open the bottle, then take a huge swig from the bottle before spitting it out and throwing the bottle to the floor. As we drove by him, he was still doubled over spitting and dry heaving, so we flipped him off. I responded to several complex suicide bombings, which resulted in hundreds of casualties, and while they bother me, they weren't the worst thing. There was a guy in my unit. Charles Alvin Williams III was his name. He had come from a really messed up background, but wore his heart on his sleeve. He got all of us a copy of Halo while we were downrange, so that we could have LAN parties when we had time. He wasn't my best friend, but he was a good friend and a battle buddy. He was going through some rough times with the deployment and other personal things, and someone caught him with his loaded pistol in his mouth. Instead of sending him home, our unit demoted him, gave him extra duty, and took away his weapons for a few months. After he was given his weapons back, he resumed missions with us. We used to sit on the blue deck on CNS and smoke and talk about life. He told me that his fiancée had ended things with him, and he was taking it hard. He told me, specifically, that he wrote her a letter, and if she wouldn't take him back, he would kill himself. I hadn't yet been through any kind of suicide prevention training, so I wasn't sure how to respond. I told him that there are better ways to deal with the situation, but I didn't do enough. The last conversation that we had was about pulling the trigger on combatants. The last thing that he told me was that he didn't mind returning fire if he needed to, but if he ever saw someone killing an innocent person, then he would stop them himself. That night he put a 3-round burst into his head. Not a day goes by when I don't think about him and think about how I could have helped him, but didn't. We all knew he was suicidal, and none of us did a damn thing about it. Daily I think about him. Why didn't I do more? What could I have done better? I'm sorry for not doing enough, man. I didn't think you would do it. Probably gonna get buried. Marine. Here, I've only shared this with 1, maybe 2 people. We were on patrol with another squad in Ramadi, Iraq. We, 2nd SQD, were about 1/2 mile ahead of our other, 1st SQD, squad when we heard the deafening rip of an IED. It was close, too close. Our walkers went off like fireworks. 1st squad was hit. They got the radioman. He was alive, but their calm was down. The radioman from my squad and I just started running towards the location of the blast. I'll never forget feeling so alone. My 22-year-old body ran as fast as it could, with a 19-year-old radioman in tow. We weren't even looking for threats. We just needed to get to 1st squad. Absolutely terrifying. I just remember, if we are too slow, someone dies. When we finally arrived, the corpsman was already working on 1st squad's radioman. He was a bloody mess. Literally. My radioman was finally able to call in the cords for medevac. First squad eventually grabbed the bloody radioman and dragged him into a nearby courtyard. Since we were all sitting ducks within moments, as we usually did, we took to the roofs. Better vantage. As medevac came in to collect the radioman, boom, secondary IED went off right where we were caring for him. Point movies depict the fog of war, but I remember going numb and slamming my M16A4 on that rooftop. I was mad, sad, confused all at once. I instantly picked my rifle back up and began to scan the area. I looked southbound through my ACOG, Advanced Combat Optical Gun sight, and spotted a kid, maybe 11 to 14. He was holding a phone. Mobile and cordless phones were the triggers of choice for IEDs. Unconsciously, I snapped the safety off and drew every bit of slack out of that trigger. That sear/hammer was one breath away from sending a 5.56mm through that little faker's chest from 150 yards. I remember gasping for breath and snapping the safety back on. Did this kid pull the trigger? Maybe. Will you kill a kid? No. Is the radioman alive? Yes. We need to get the fuck out of here. I still hate this story. Edit. Did the kid use the phone to set off the IED or IEDs? Did someone put a gun to his head and tell him to go outside and set it off? Was he calling a family member about the explosions? Who knows? The secondary IED went off in the street after we had cleared out. It was targeting the HMMWVs that arrived to collect radioman. IED attacks usually targeted the corpsman, medic, the radioman and our pickup transportation. Thanks for the gold, stranger. I haven't told anyone this entire story as it isn't something I'm comfortable talking to people about face to face, but I feel it's probably something people should know and think about at least. I was deployed to a place called the Triangle of Death in Iraq in a little town called Yusufia. We had been there for 6 months with a lot of intense fighting and were set to rotate to southern Iraq in a much less active spot. We were set to be replaced by the 502nd I, part of the 101st Airborne. They had been a large part of the initial invasion of Iraq against Saddam's forces, but this was 2005 and was a much different war. When you transition units in the military, there is a period where you integrate front seat/back seat rides, where you show the incoming unit your current operations. I happened to be at an outpost by one of 2 remaining bridges across the Euphrates River when this started. We tried to caution them, show them the ropes, but they didn't want to listen to any of us. They kept saying we have a destiny along with other hyper-aggressive statements. They didn't even seem to see the Iraqis as human beings. They were just like, we are gonna fuck this place up and fuck them. Rape, kill, pillage, and burn. Hooker, across the street from this particular outpost, was an Iraqi guy and his family who owned the small farm around the outpost. They had been really good to us, pointing out IEDs on roads as well as running and grabbing us food and supplies when we couldn't get any. For example, our supply truck was destroyed by an IED one time, so all we had were MREs to eat. We talked to the farmer and gave him a shopping list and money, and he bought us food at the local marketplace. He was a great guy and did stuff like that for us all the time. We took the 502nd guys on a foot patrol and the farmer came out of his house, greeting us as he usually did, making his way towards us. We waved and started talking to him. When he went to shake the hand of one of the 502nd privates, the private just hauled off and punched him in the mouth, shouting "faking sand nigger." Our platoon sergeant restrained him and sent him back to the outpost with my sergeant and I to escort him. While he tried to placate the farmer, we took that private to his sergeant, who congratulated him. When our platoon sergeant got back, he tore them a new one, but they didn't seem to care. I wasn't privy to the conversation between my platoon sergeant and his, but it didn't seem to have any impact either. Their attitude persisted until we finally left to our new location. Turns out, these same people were these guys. They murdered that farmer's family a few months after we left and raped his daughter. As if this wasn't enough, a few months prior to this, I had been injured when my truck rolled over during a firefight. I was the gunner, maybe 200 meters from where the killings took place. I had to be medevaced to Baghdad, where I recovered for a few weeks. When the truck rolled over, I lost my wallet in the dirt out there in what we called Iraqi moon dust, which is a powdery silt type soil you find all over. Flash forward to a week or two after the killings took place. I received a package from Sergeant Green. It's my wallet, mailed March 12, 2006, the same day as the killings. I recognize it's highly unlikely it happened just like this, but I can't help but wonder if they found my wallet on their way to commit the murders, or even if they mailed it just before it happened. I'm not a religious person, I'm an atheist, but I like to think that it was perhaps the universe's way of trying to remind them of the front seat, backseat period with our unit, where we had a simple message for them. Treat people with respect and like human beings. It is all they want. I still have the wallet. I've had it since high school. An old Calvin Klein leather wallet my sister gave me. It reminds me of the farmer and his family. I can't help but wonder if maybe we had been more focused on getting our message across to that 502nd group. If this could have been avoided. Maybe we were in too much of a hurry to leave for safer territory, that we neglected something that might have made a difference. We even had the option to volunteer to stay in Yusufia with the 502nd if we wanted, but I declined. Not out of fear of combat, as I was comfortably numb to it at that point, but because I just wanted to go relax and was homesick. It makes me think that I could have made a difference, but didn't because of something simplistically selfish. It's probably silly to think that, and perhaps a bit cliche, but it is what I think. Not what I know you are looking for, but here it goes. I was never the popular kid in high school and got picked on a lot throughout my entire K-12 education. I joined up at 17 to get away from home and start earning my own money. I also got picked on a lot in basic. Soldiers spend more time fighting each other than the enemy. It's not that way for everyone, but enough so that it's sad point anyways. I wasn't the lowest on the rung in basic. Luckily, it was another guy in his early 20s. He was a nerd like me, but he also messed up and failed a lot. Your typical Gomer pile. I won't list all his infractions as I can't remember them all. But one night we were out in the field doing training. It was like 5 to 6 weeks in, and we were doing land nav. My fire watch had just ended, so I headed to the only porta-john in our area to relieve myself before acting out again. I get there, and the door is locked, so I knock and ask how long they were going to be. He asked, "Dr. Sick, is that you?" It was Gomer pile, of course. "Yeah man, hurry up, I've gotta go, I can't." Man, the guy before me sheet on the seat, and I couldn't see, and I sat in it. Freaking Gomer pile. "Okay man, just stay there." Where was he going to go? "I'll be back with some baby wipes and hand sanitizer. Could you bring me my spare uniform too? I think I got some on it." "Sure." Man, I never told any of the other guys about it. His life was hard enough, and I'm no longer in contact with them, so there's no way for this to get back to the guy. I can't even remember his name anymore. TLDR. Fellow soldier sat in sheet. I helped him out. I lived in a safe house in the Kabul Green Zone a couple of years ago, working at ISAF HQ, but moving throughout Kabul every day. The street from my compound to ISAF was filled with pedestrian traffic and these kids who would try to sell foreigners whatever trinkets they could. I got to know them since I was there every day. I got them clothes for winter, random snacks from the chow hall, and we played Angry Birds together. They spoke with me, brought me scarves I asked for, and little gifts every once in a while. They also kept the other peddlers away. One day a kid, 12 to 14 years old, from elsewhere came to the area with a bomb in his backpack. He intended to kill foreigners moving in the area or target one of the compounds. The local kids noticed him and apparently told him to get lost, and he detonated his bomb. 4 kids were killed along with the bomber and a couple of adults. A dozen or so injured maybe. I knew each one of the kids. Kashi, a little girl who was learning to skate. Noab, who, in my view of things, looked to have a hard crush on one of the other girls who was killed. Another boy had a brother a year or so older who looked just like him. I saw the one killed and saw the other a week later, trying to sell things again. It freaked me out. I was at the site of the bombing not 30 minutes before I felt it while inside ISAF. Seeing the bodies after was a mistake. I didn't need to be there. I walked by the site every day until I left that base. The night of the attack I could still smell blood and the damp smell of wet Kabul dust mixed together. Every day I went by I could see their bodies and the surrounding gore in my head. I have seen the aftermath of VBIEDs in Iraq where hundreds were killed, but something about knowing those faces so well Kids that would have done well if not born into such a backwards shithole. Point. It didn't help that right after my ex told me I deserved to see those things, since I chose to be there again. Point. Sorry for rambling, but I'm not sure which aspects of it all to tell. This is where the bomb went off only a few days before it actually happened. The boys Noab, the oldest of those killed. I don't remember the girl's name, but she is the one Noab liked. I always loved seeing them together, because it just seemed wonderful to see a couple of kids flirting with one another in a place where you just don't expect that. The bomb detonated in front of those steps by the pole, and both metal gates on the sides of the shop were completely shredded by the blast. Said it. Word/picture/ and thank you all for the kind words. Joking answer. A shit ton of dicks. Seriously, infantrymen are like little kids, always running around but naked. Point. Serious answer. We were ordered to shoot/bayonet any bodies we came across, because the militia had a habit of playing possum, only to kill coalition troops later. Well, in Iraqi summer heat, after a few days of laying there, the bodies will puff up. They get super bloated, and just nasty overall. But you can't always tell, especially if they are all covered up. Point. Well, when you shoot/bayonet/kick a bloated body, they tend to pop, and out comes the nastiest smell and a disgusting liquid pus/poo. Jesus, nothing smells that bad, and the goo/pus gets all over your boots, or uniform, or rifle, or God help you, your mouth. Much vomit was spewed forth, many memories cemented forever. Edit. 9 times out of 10, it was easy to tell they were dead. After being hit with 105mm, 40mm, 25mm, .50, 7.62, 5.56, or 9mm rounds, there usually wasn't much left. What was left was also food for the fleet of feral dogs that followed us. So, if we came across an intact body, it was either alive and waiting, or had been passed over by the dogs. The feeling of not feeling anything after killing someone is crazy. It's not like you're stone cold, no emotion. But think of it as you're a waiter at a restaurant and you serve your customers. You don't think anything of it when it's happening. You just do and carry on. It doesn't hit you until later and you're like, mother faker, I just did that. The emotion of everything is so bland when it happens, but so raw when you take a step back. Whenever you have a buddy that gets killed, yeah, it's scary, but it doesn't hit you until later. Every moment in that person's life had led up to that moment. It's concluded, over, done. Every first kiss, every Friday night football game, every person they ever had any contact or relationship with, everything they ever said, every plan they ever had, or memory they had created, came to a conclusion in a single moment that ended their entire existence. TLDR, life is precious. Don't take it for granted. I took part in 78 separate attacks from hostile forces around Mosul in 2005. Lots of bad shit, but the one thing I never share is that one time I was in the turret of an M1114 HMMWV behind a M2.50 machine gun doing convoy security, and I looked in a vehicle as we cruised by, and there was a little girl, probably 8, who had a healed up gunshot wound to the face. She was missing an eye. She was smiling broadly at me and waved at me emphatically. I just waved back. That little girl had the weight of the world on her shoulders and was smiling. I've never had a bad day since. There was also a kid that was cut deep to where his thumb was barely hanging onto his hand. I was in the turret again that day, and the kid ran alongside the truck making a rapping motion with his hand. I tried to get my first aid pouch open so I could throw him my sterile bandage to wrap up his hand, but the old button, Vietnam era piece of sheet, wouldn't come unsnapped. The little dude ran next to us for about a minute while I faked with it. Finally I just slipped the Alice clips, tugged it off my vest, and tossed the whole thing to him. He was smiling the whole time too, and was very happy for the packet. It's like, fuck man, we really faked shit up over there. Why couldn't we have done more really good stuff instead of escorting Commander Douchebag and the whole faking PR team to a school, just so they could get some faking photo ops with the poor kids to put in the newspaper back home? This happened on the stateside point. I was a MP for 5 years. Many faked up, and some hilarious stories. This is the most faked up one. We get a call for a health and welfare check at one of the on-post houses. We get these all the time, usually hoarders. We go in, and it's the same ol' hoarder bullshit. Dirty diapers and animal sheet piled waist high in the corner, kicking trash out of the way to walk through, moldy rotten dishes in the sink, etc. We are going room to look at everything, and that's when I see it. A baby in its crib, not moving and blue in the face. I call for the supervisors on the radio and I grab the baby and turn it over. There's blood coming from its mouth. I updated I yell to my partner to restrain the father. Mother was deployed. He does. I don't know what to do. I'm not trained for this. Never did CPR on a baby. I do what I can, and it's barely breathing and has a faint heartbeat. Sups show up, shortly followed by EMS. They rush the baby to the hospital, while we turn our attention to the dipshit who did this to this poor baby. Apparently the baby wouldn't stop screaming. I guess a 4-day-old diaper would do that to you. So he kept shoving a bottle in its mouth to get it to stop. He caused the frenulum to rip, hence the blood, and the baby was choking on its tongue. The baby didn't make it. We all wanted to kill this faker, but at this point we have to baby him. Be real easy on the cuffs. No bumps or bruises. Nothing. Didn't want to give him a reason to get off. I don't remember how long he got, but I remember getting pissed that it wasn't near long enough. TLDR. Read it. I faking typed it. Edit. Words. I'm on mobile. I guess I never really tell anyone anything, unless they were directly involved. I'll try to keep them short and sweet. My engineer unit was tasked with clearing a road that had been black status for 7 years. Midway in we get ambushed by a whole village on both sides. We nearly ran out of crew-served ammo that day. What really gets me about it is that just minutes before it all went down, a mother and her child ran to safety in a nearby building. And to my recollection there wasn't a single building we didn't hit with either Mark 19 or Polish strikers. We tore that village to pieces when it was over. It doesn't really bother me, but I do wonder how much more harm we did than good. On a lighter note, in basic training one of my battles was really chafing on his ass. He couldn't quite get the baby powder in his crack. He must have really trusted me because he asked me very discreetly and I obliged. So there I am, shooting baby powder into other guys' ass. Not a retired soldier, but a naval hospital corpsman with a marine unit who deployed to Sanji Valley, Afghanistan in 2012. I've seen a lot of casualties in my short time in the Navy, but no amount of love tissue training could prepare me for my first no-sheet trauma patient. It wasn't even one of my Marines who got hit. I was chilling at the battalion aid station with a group of other corpsmen getting our sheet together and talking about who would survive a zombie apocalypse when we got a call that we had a patient coming in. This was about 1 week into the deployment. We had just gotten to the FOB and the majority of us were pushing out to patrol bases the next few days. I was one of the most senior corpsmen there, HM3/E4, so I was in charge of leading the team and treating this patient. We had a PA there, but he was more interested in sleeping and trusted our medical knowledge to be able to treat this patient properly. When the Vic came in I ran outside to get a good look at the patient before he came in, and I was not expecting what I saw. He was an older gentleman, probably around 70, hard to tell, and he had stepped on an IED and had bilateral above the knee amputations. Tourniquets had been applied and bleeding controlled by the time he got into the bays. My team attached monitors, applied secondary tourniquets, and got fourth access while I secured the airway. After what seemed like seconds we had finished our first and second assessment and we were waiting in the bird when the propac stopped reading any vitals. I remember looking down at the man and seeing that there wasn't any life in his eyes. We attempted CPR for a few cycles, but without blood products it was useless. I called it. We were removing all of the interventions we had done when we rolled him over, and I noticed a small incision below his buttock, and above where the tourniquet was applied there was a small slice where some shrapnel had flown up and severed his femoral. This was my team I was supposed to lead, and I killed this patient because I couldn't get level-headed enough to remember the simple things I learned in CTM/TCCC. I have had many trauma patients since that day, but this one sticks to me the most. I have stumbled upon shacks full of dead and dying people, had friends get shot and blown up, but my first casualty haunts me every night. I have since used this particular patient as a learning mechanism, now that I'm a seasoned instructor of TCCC, so that hopefully my students don't make the same mistake. I'm on mobile, so sorry for formatting. But this is gonna be buried anyway. Also, I get out in 12 days. Super stoked. TLDR, killed my first trauma patient in country, kind of a beach about it. Reposting from another Ask Reddit thread. Updating with additional details. Here it goes, again. During my second deployment to Iraq in 2009, I was a combat medic attached to an armored company. We frequently did patrols through a town called Bartella, just outside of Mosul. We would dismount, do meet and greets, interact with the locals, etc. They were incredibly friendly people and we never had one bad incident originate from that town. One day while we were on patrol, a Peshmerga unit signaled for us to stop. Our interpreter was told a suicide bomber had hit the town's open air market and they needed help providing security, while the others moved the wounded and dead. The walk into the area was chaotic, civilians trying to get away, ambulances with lights and sirens going, Peshmerga vehicles flying by. It was a mess. When we got to the market, I went off by myself to help with the wounded. I was better trained in first aid than most people in the vicinity. I realize it was stupid to do so, but I was determined to help these people who treated us so well. I was a combat veteran, so this wasn't my first time around dead bodies or blood. In fact, most of it didn't really register to me at all. I saw kids being carried away, obviously covered in blood from head to toe. I saw Peshmerga trying to match body parts with corpses. There was even a dead, eviscerated mule. What did register was a bloody shoe/boot in the middle of it all. I stared at it for what seemed like a few hours, but I guess it was probably only a few minutes. I picked it up and saw there was still a foot inside. I couldn't tell if it belonged to a man or woman, adult or child. I just set it down and walked back to my platoon. They didn't ask me anything, and I did not say anything in return. It was at that point that I finally realized it was all pointless. Earlier that year, we had lost a soldier in our company to a sniper in a town about 45 minutes down the road from us. A few months after the bombing, 2 others would be killed from a massive IED that tore an MRAP to shreds. Iraq would never benefit from our intervention, and that the people themselves could generally not give less of a shit unless it benefited them directly. It's a horrible and inaccurate generalization, but it's one that has been difficult for me to shake. There are many things I haven't shared with anyone, but I can share just a few for now. I was deployed to Panjwai, Afghanistan in 2010 to 2011, and we were the first American soldiers on that ground, since Special Forces and Rangers occupied it in 2006, which was taken back over by Taliban very quickly after they left. We got called out to search for a dead enemy that a Predator drone shot earlier in the night. We found him and called it up as normal. As we were heading back to the patrol base, the sun was starting to rise, and we were all deadbeat tired at this time and just ready to get in our bunks to catch some rest. We operated in Strickers, 8-wheeled medium armored vehicles, and the lead vehicle hit an enormous IED that made the front 4 tires fly at least 200 feet away. We have hit several IEDs up to this point, so we proceeded with protocol, radioing up to the down vehicle for any sustained injuries. No one answered, so a team including myself dismounted to provide support. As we walk to the vehicle, you get that gut feeling that you know it is bad, really bad. We sweep the area quickly for any more secondary IEDs and then start doing our best to get inside and help everyone. We pulled the passengers in the back out who were unconscious and bleeding from the head. The driver was jammed in between a metal sheet and unconscious as well. We had people immediately start to treat the passengers while we continued to get the driver out. Finally it budged and we freed him. His entire lower body felt almost like a bowl of jello, no bones keeping it intact. The medevacs were already well on their way, but we all knew there wasn't much they could do at this point. Medevacs finally arrived and escorted them back to CAF. A few hours later we made it back to base and no one slept, sitting in silence waiting for any updates or news. Finally around dinner time we heard something. We got the breaking news that the driver's pulse stopped on the helicopter to CAF. The 3 passengers in the back suffered from severe TB, traumatic brain injury. I still keep in contact with them, and they will never be the same. They have a short-term memory and can barely read or talk to anyone. The driver was 19 years old, a young, quiet, naive kid that you would never expect anything to happen to. I've experienced many things that I will never forget or tell anyone in person, but this really hit me the hardest. This was in the month of November, which is partially the reason I even decided to type this out. Honestly, I lost 3 close friends in this month, and it is extremely difficult every time it comes around. I know I said I had a few stories to tell, but it is getting increasingly harder to type it out as I keep rambling on. Several of my fellow friends have taken their lives or seriously contemplated it from the deployments we have been on. If anyone needs to talk, I'm here with you and understand everything you are going through. First time posting, so try and cut me some slack. For obvious reasons I'll keep this very general. Be advised, severe trigger warning. I was in transit to a new command, and I was posted in temporary duty under the base security, where I was flying out from. While there, they had me do fingerprinting and lots of paperwork for them until one day they told me they were going to need another body with them. I'm military police, so they figured they could have me tag along. We respond to a call of a woman smuggling marijuana and selling it off base. We pull her aside from her workplace as discreetly as possible, which is tough to do, considering everyone in the building recognized us as base police, and tell her we need to search her vehicle. She hands over her keys, and one guy talks to her to keep her distracted, while myself and the other guy search through her vehicle. I found 4 prescription bottles filled to the lid with marijuana. At this point, I look at the other guy with me, and he begs them and takes the woman to the patrol vehicle to go check her in. Here's why I don't tell this story. This woman has severe PTSD. It was so bad that I couldn't ride in the car with them. Her screams were animalistic. She sounded like a tortured creature in the backseat of the squad car, and she was clawing at the door to get out. It wrenched my stomach more than the cheese omelette MRE. Eventually, I get to the station after them, and they of course have me do her fingerprinting and paperwork. When she tells me her story, she was stationed at a country where she was driving a government vehicle for work errands, and a pedestrian ran out in the road, and she hit them. The local police were the first responders and instantly locked her up in an all-female prison, while her command fought the local police for her to be released to US custody. While in this prison, she said the guards would walk in while 2 women were sleeping and randomly rape inmates. She would wake up in the middle of the night to screams of women fighting for their lives, and she developed a severe paranoia of when her turn would come. After her eventual release, that paranoia manifested into an extreme PTSD that was triggered when locked in confined spaces, hence her reaction in the back of the squad vehicle. She didn't sell the marijuana. It was the only thing that calmed her down. I finished my shift that day and called my sister up and bawled. I could never tell her about this day because this girl was the spitting image of my sister. The convoy stopped in some dirt village. The sun was starting to go down and all the kids and females went into the building about 15 yards to my left. A bunch of pickups came into the village full of military-aged males who then went into the fields, pulled up long boxes, and broke into groups, then scattered around various covers and buildings with said boxes. I wonder what is about to happen, man. I'm glad the rules of engagement won't let us do jack shit about this. Just as the sun goes down low, and behold an ambush from the west with rockets and RPK fire. The gunner is pointed west, to the right, and doing what gunners do at times like this. As the sun sets and twilight turns to dark, full on Star Wars mode is engaged, tracers everywhere. The first component attacked when the sun touched the ground from the west. The second wave hit us from the east. When the sun disappeared, a guy came out of the building to my left where the rocket kicked open the truck door and put my optics on the guy's chest to see a completely terrified kid's face. I don't know if I shot. I know the fire support with the 30mm chain gun did. It blew them away in 4x zoom along with the small building they came out of. During the invasion of Iraq, civilians would line the road begging for food and water. We were approaching the edge of a no-name village just south of Al-Hilal, Babylon, and there was another large group of civilians begging. We had already been briefed not to give them anything, as many of them were obviously army, short haircuts, a few days beard, that had either defected or were Fedayeen in disguise. Also, we barely had enough for ourselves. We were moving too fast for our supply lines to keep up. Anyway, there was this group of civilians begging. And then, at the edge, away from anyone else, was a little girl. She was crying and holding her hands out to us. She didn't look much older than my own child, who was a toddler at the time. This girl was maybe 5 or 6. She was separate from the group, no family nearby. We figured they were already dead. Her cries were completely silent. She just held her hands out there, tears running down her face, her mouth open. My gunner said, "Fuck this. Someone hand me an MRE." Someone else tossed him one up. The interpreter, an Iraqi as well, said, "No, mister, don't do that." Of course, the gunner ignored him. The driver slowed down, and the gunner tossed the MRE down to the girl. She picked it up and ran towards the remains of some roadside market stand made of reeds and dried palm fronds. As we sped up, we noticed the group moving towards her. They surrounded her. The gunner spun his gun back around and screamed for them to get back. They didn't. About 5 or 6 adults swarmed on her. A second later, 2 or 3 broke from the group, fighting. One had the MRE packet. She was laying there, and the gunner yelled, "Fuck, she's bleeding, stop the truck." She was dead. They beat her to death over an MRE. Hate to be that guy, but I actually have a story my grandfather shared from his time during the Pacific Theater back during World War II. My grandfather never had a glorious job in the Navy. He was a cook. He spent hours upon hours cooling and cleaning. Even though he was a cook, he also had 4 confirmed Japanese zero kills in his time. He was a part of the carrier group that left Pearl before the attack, and he was also on the US Springfield in its trip from the US to Iwo Jima when they transported the atomic bombs. He thankfully was transferred off the Springfield at Iwo and put on another ship. Onto the story. After the surrender, he got to walk around Hiroshima to witness the aftermath of the atomic bomb that had been dropped there. He was assisting with cooking and helping Japanese citizens. He described in detail seeing people disfigured, burnt, half dead and deformed from the blast. But the thing he described in detail to me that I will always remember was he walked down a road and past a concrete wall that was still standing after the blast. It wasn't very tall, just about 5 feet tall. But he said, if you looked on the concrete wall there were outlines, and he said the one outline that stood out was obviously a parent shielding their child. Of course there was no real detail to tell what or who it was, but he said the way it looked was obvious that a child and her parents were there at that moment. He said the feeling that he was looking at the only thing left of a parent and their child instantly vaporized by a force only comparable to that of the sun frightened him. Of course he had a lot more memories of sailors burning alive after a kamikaze struck their ship or men being cut in half by the wing of a kamikaze diver. He died in 2000 from cancer. After the war he worked at the nuclear power plant and helped install the reactor in Port Lavaca, Texas. He also scraped asbestos off of pipes and also chewed tobacco and smoked 2 packs a day minimum. Since the 40s. I have the pictures he took from the aftermath somewhere in a box. I'll see if I can find them. An early morning salvo of 3 rockets blew a tent near my hut to bits while I was in Afghanistan. I ran over to the HESCO bunker in my sleep. After I had come a little bit, I was checking what I had with me. This is the part that I've never really shared with anyone else, but I didn't notice for a minute. I only had on my combat shirt, Kevlar, and weapon, and then was completely nude from the waist down. I was Porky Pig in it while shit was blowing up around us. It's all I could think about. I felt really awkward about it, even though I've seen and been seen naked by everyone there. I think I just really didn't want to be caught up in a fight without pants. It was racing through my mind. If there's a perimeter breach, I need to get to my Foot Locker first and get some pants on. I was rehearsing it in my mind. Luckily the laundry tent took the brunt of the attack, but that really put us back on clean clothes for a bit. As an infantryman, I had plenty of bad experiences in Afghanistan. Plenty I haven't told people. However, I had some very unique and beautiful experiences. I have never told anyone this story. My platoon was probably a month and a half into our 1-year-long deployment. The area we were responsible for patrolling was remote and poor even by Afghan standards. It would take us probably 2 hours by vehicle to get to our area of operations, the district we were responsible for patrolling. That was just getting to it, not including the farthest villages in the district we were responsible for patrolling. Since it would take us so long to get there, we would drive there and then set up shop in this abandoned school for 2 to 3 days and run patrols out of there. One day, we returned from our regular day patrol. We had a couple hours of downtime before we would set out for our night patrol. It was late afternoon/early evening, and I was sitting outside under the Afghan sun with my body armor on, but no helmet. Just taking in the scenery. Looking out over the countryside, I saw these 3 girls, probably around 10 to 12 years of age, frolicking in a field. Just being young girls. I remember they were dressed in brightly colored dresses and hijabs, one purple and one red. Can't remember the other. They were maybe 150, 200 meters away. The scene of them playing in this farm field, with mountains in the background, was a very idyllic setting, so I decided to try and take a photo of them. I had a small case on my body armor with my camera in it. I reached down to take it out and take a photo, but they scurried away. A minute or so later, they returned, so I tried again. Again, they scurry away. This repeats several more times. I remember thinking, damn it, stay still for a second, so I can take a photo. Then I realized they were watching me. They knew I was going for my camera, and they would scurry away when I went for it. This was before I realized certain cultures' aversions to having their photo taken, let alone without their permission. Had turned into a game. I would quickly touch my camera case, and they would scurry away, then come back giggling. Repeat. Then they started playing like a Simon Says game with me. They would make little motions with their hands, do the raccoon eyes, and whatnot. I would mimic them, and then they would look at each other giggling. Eventually, it got dark, and they had to leave. I think about those little girls often. It helped realize the beauty in that country. Despite all the destruction and death, that was their home. That is where their lives would take place. What has become of their lives? I hope that they can know some semblance of peace in their lives. I served with 2 para in the British Army. I joined up in 2009 and only recently got out on a medical discharge. A mortar round destroyed a lot of nerves in my back. I still have 100% mobility, but I can't feel my lower middle back, so I can't be a paratrooper anymore. I've been out for a while now and so many people ask me ridiculously stupid questions on a subject they know absolutely nothing about, and I couldn't explain if I tried. Things like, did you kill anyone? And did you drive any tanks and other stupid shit like that. Gets right on my nerves. Ironic. I do have one fairly traumatic story though. My platoon was out on patrol and we were coming across this irrigated field in a loose staggered formation, so we were pretty spread out. If an IED goes off, minimal casualties. So we are walking on this field, and then someone from a well-concealed position opens fire on us, followed by a few more. We all take cover. The Taliban had chosen a terrible place for an ambush. It may be an open field with trees on all sides, but irrigation ditches make great cover. So I set my GPMG up and returned fire with everyone else. Now this is the only engagement I fought that could be described as close up. All the others were 800 yards plus at least. But this one, while not exactly danger close, if we were to call in CAS, was still a lot more personal than I liked. I'd probably estimate the whole fight took place within 50 to 100 yards. So I'm firing. I probably go through about 600 rounds, which is a lot for this type of engagement. That's all the ammo I carry plus a 200 round belt carried by another bloke. Now anyone who hasn't seen combat probably thinks it's how it is in the movies, all that tactical shit and everyone is cool as a snowman's bullocks. It's not like that. When you're in a close proximity firefight, everyone pretty much loses their heads. Blokes will shout the most ridiculous things and fire off all their ammo as fast as they possibly can. I still haven't got to the horrible bit. I've been writing this for almost half an hour now, and I'm putting it off. We were starting to get the upper hand now, and that's when I saw this young Afghan lad on the edge of trees, firing his AK from the hip, not in cover. He had no idea what he was doing. He couldn't have been older than 16. And I didn't even hesitate. That's what scares me. I wheeled my GPMG around and fired 2 bursts at him. and he just came apart, just like that. Red mist. I didn't even think about it until the fight was done. He was the only person I'm sure I hit and killed in my time in the green machine. I'm not going to lie and say I wake up sweating and screaming every night, because I don't. But sometimes I'll be sitting having a drink or watching TV and I suddenly think about him. I can justify it to myself saying he might have hit one of my mates. But I'm pretty sure I'll never ever forget him. Sorry for wall of text. First time I've ever told this story. I didn't even summarize it in the AAR. Made a throwaway for this. I've never been able to tell my loved ones about this. Sometimes you want to spare them the knowledge of just how much darkness there is inside of you. I'm not sure how I feel about telling complete strangers either, but it's been burning a hole inside of me for some time now. I made the mistake of falling in love with a fellow Marine. We kept it a secret, of course, for professional reasons. We deployed together, and still, no one knew. We never touched each other, made eyes at each other, or ever did anything that would be inappropriate during the deployment, which was torture in and of itself. A few months into the deployment, we were passing out food, candy, and other supplies to a village. It was part of the whole hearts and minds thing. A little girl walked up to get some candy from the man I was in love with. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She was holding a doll that someone had given her with an IED sewn into it. As soon as she took the candy from his hand, the IED detonated. It blew both of them apart instantly, injured 3 other people. I couldn't scream. I couldn't cry. I just remember watching it happen. I don't even remember hearing anything. I think the worst part was picking up the pieces of him afterward. Picking up his arms that had held me but were now in shreds. I don't even know how to describe what it felt like. It's so cliché to say, but a big piece of me died that day. I'm ashamed of what I've become. I no longer feel human. I feel like something inside of me is terribly wrong, and I'm afraid that it's never going to get better. I can't talk for everyone, but I felt like I had to set aside my humanity in order to survive and do the things I did. At first it was great. I'd set it aside and I'd feel distant / alone / disconnected for a short time, which was better than feeling pain / fear / regret. Then it started happening more and more often without me even thinking about it. Pretty soon it was the norm. I felt like I was no longer in control. I felt like I was in the passenger seat and I was just spectating. I think a wire got crossed for good. Even now I struggle with controlling my disconnect / rage. It can be the stupidest thing that can set me off. The rage I feel is hard to explain. It's akin to the fight or flight response, well, at least to me. I feel this smoldering heat in my chest that spreads and becomes unbearable. Then my head feels euphoric, almost like I'm high and having sex. It's fleeting as fuck. Then the cold indifference kicks in, and I accept everything and anything, no matter how faked up it might be. I will never be 100% normal ever again, and I'm deeply ashamed of it. It makes me feel weak and exposed. I don't feel like I deserve happiness or love. Yet I keep going, because other people I care about love me, and their happiness depends on me being alive. I've lost track of the number of times I've looked up at the sky and thought to myself, what a beautiful day to die. One day my suffering and self-loathing will end, but until that day I will be here waiting impatiently. I've been ready for the end for years. My friends are waiting for me at the end of oblivion. I need to better myself for myself, and those that depend on me. I'm going to have a really late start, but I need to go to college and get a decent degree so I can get a decent career. It's a daunting task emotionally, mentally, and financially to me, but I think it's for the best. Also I love dogs. Dogs were like rats in my neighborhood of Al Hilal, Iraq. Me and a group of guys operated out of a house in the middle of the city. We ate local food, employed local guards, a barber, a cook, and translators. Everything we did was a bit of a community action. We were neighbors with these people. Every night the dogs right across the river that bordered our house would be howling, yipping, fighting, and carrying on. Often, a rifle shot would ring out as one of the locals would try to quiet the dogs to get some sleep, but it was futile. Usually, it just riled them up more. I was on the rooftop pretty often watching for troublemakers across the river. Lots of times, folks would use the night as cover to try to sneak up the tops of abandoned buildings near us and cut down power lines to get and sell the copper in them. This is dangerous, obviously, so I'd just fire a flare or cluster grenade from our M79 above their heads to scare them off. Mostly, though, what I was doing was watching those dogs through my night optics. It was calming to watch them. It was like a Nat Geo show. One night 5 or 6 of our team guys came up to the roof armed and just said, "We can't sleep." I joined them at the ledge and we opened fire on the dogs. It was that strange place between discomfort and peer pressure. I knew that team sleep was more important than native dogs. I knew that dogs were different sort of animals in that part of the world. It made me feel like garbage. We must have killed 60 of them. Their bodies lined the bank of the river the next morning. People came out of their houses, stood on the banks of the river on top of all the dogs, kicking them, dancing around them, and cheering at us, clapping their hands, blowing kisses, etc. High fives and handshakes all around from our employed locals. I feel like vomiting thinking about it now. I grew up on a farm. I'm used to animals dying. Even there, on a mission, we rolled with a K9. If there was a native dog on our objective, it died first. We couldn't risk an infected bite to our team dog. It makes perfect logical sense from a tactical standpoint. I'm rambling now, trying to justify it to myself or others. I don't know. I killed so many dogs. I just try to ignore it now. I have a gorgeous golden retriever that means the world to me. I feel like garbage. It nearly affected me more than things I've experienced with other human beings. Not sure what that says about me. Like the larger part of the people in the military, when I was deployed, I didn't see any combat. I never left the fob and I never fired my weapon at a person. But that doesn't mean I didn't experience anything terrifying. Rocket and mortar attacks were the scariest thing in my world in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I deployed to Iraq in 2008. 3 mere months out of 8, and experienced my first mortar attack in less than a month in country. We were hit by multiple mortars shortly after lunch one day in July 8th. None came too close to where we were working at and a few didn't detonate when they hit the ground. One that did was the one that landed the closest to our work area and was probably within 100 feet of the bunker that went into when the warning sirens went off. That night I went to the gym to lift a little and then get in a few games of basketball. The fob I was on was a blackout fob. What this means is, after the sun goes down, there are very few outside lights on. Mainly small lights on a few buildings, light shining out of a window or tent or the flashlight you carry with you. Unfortunately for me, while I was playing basketball, someone snatched my flashlight from where I left it with my stuff, so I had to walk back to my tent in complete darkness. It was roughly a mile from the gym to my tent, but felt like 10. Everything I heard sounded like incoming rounds and time seemed to drag on. By the time I was able to successfully navigate back to my tent, I was drenched in more sweat than when I left the gym. I quickly took a shower, ran back to my bed in the tent and quietly cried myself to sleep. All I could think of is how scared I was and how I couldn't control what scared me. I couldn't control when or where the mortars came from. All I wanted to do was make it back from the country and into my wife's arms. It took me over a year to tell my wife that we had had mortar attacks in Iraq, but I never told her what happened the rest of that night. I've seen someone with their face blown off, someone with a hand missing and someone with half their torso missing. I was in a dining facility when a mortar came through the roof and didn't detonate. Yet none of that scared me as much as the first night of my first mortar attack. There are some very terrible stories on here, too many of which I can relate with. Although there were much worse things that happened daily, there is one instance that still stands out in my mind. We were patrolling West Baghdad and had stopped to talk with some of the locals. This was in early 2004, when we didn't really know what it was they wanted out of us, but we were trying to win hearts and minds and stay alive in the process. The interpreter and I were talking to a family about something trivial, providing dumpsters for their trash I believe, and their 8-year-old son was climbing all over me like a monkey. The right thing to do would have been to keep my distance from the boy and keep situational awareness, but it was nice to be looked at as a human, not an occupying force. Out of nowhere we were hit with a series of 10 to 15 small but rapid mortars. My squad had 2 fairly serious injuries, but what sticks with me is the boy took some serious shrapnel as well. A few of us took shelter beside the Humvees that were there, and the rest of us, myself included, jumped into the back of a Bradley armored personnel carrier. Once we were in, the crew raised the back ramp and took off. The last thing I saw as the ramp was going up was the father running towards our vehicle with his son in his arms. I can't shake that memory. I can only assume he was bringing his son to us for help, and we closed the door on him and took off. I have no idea what happened to the boy, but I feel immense guilt for what happened. He would be an adult now. I wonder how his life has worked out. This photographer was with us that day. She rotated her pictures, but a couple from the attack are on this page. My own 2 cents on her. Fakshelin Borggren. She fabricated stories, blatantly lied on her articles, and put my men in danger more than once in order to sell a story. The year was 2001. I was stationed 2 kilometers from Ramallah, near a roadblock known as the Chicken Point. That night I was on sergeant duty, meaning I was tasked with driving the shifts around, bringing food to the roadblock, 2 cement blocks on the road in the middle of darkness, etc. Around 21:00 or so. I take my driver and Humvee and go deliver food to the roadblock. It is already pitch black. The driver knows only Russian, and everything is totally quiet. We reach the roadblock, and before we managed to unload the food we saw a car approaching very slowly, basically rolling towards us with the engine and lights on. We all got very tense, and loaded our guns, got behind the beton blocks. The car keeps rolling, and we aim our guns at it. It rolls very slowly, and we can just make some people inside. Everything is pitch black and dead quiet, and then the car bumps into some telephone pole nearby and halts. We walk slowly towards the car, rifles ready. As we near it, we notice bullet holes, dozens and dozens of them, everywhere. We look into the car. A bearded man is leaning on the steering wheel. He is covered in blood, his shirt totally red, his chest on the wheel and his head on the dash. He is as dead as he could be. A woman, also soaking red, is in the seat next to him, sort of curled, and also very dead. I was just bringing food, and now this nightmare. The car itself is covered in blood. All the windows were riddled with bullet holes. Blood is oozing from under the doors, like in a Stephen King movie. We looked at the back seat. Everyone was very tense. We don't know where the car came from, and we didn't hear any shooting. But it couldn't be from far away as the roads are curvy, and he wouldn't make it without falling in one of the valleys. The back seat. There are 3 kids. I don't remember if they were boys or girls. I just remember 3 little corpses, covered in red, and lumped together like 3 little sacks of potatoes. They still had seat belts on. We freak out a little and scream into the radio for a medics and backup. I grab one of the guys from the roadblock, throw out the food from the Humvee, and tell the driver to slam it, going the direction the car came from. After a couple of minutes, the driver says something, but he speaks only Russian. We keep going. We reach a big curve, and assume the driver couldn't have made it if the shooting was before the curve. So we jump out and start shooting light bombs, trying to find any signs, broken glass, etc. We see nothing, so we shoot at the hills. Maybe someone is hiding and this will get him to shoot at us. No use. We spent some hours on the hills, shooting light bombs and at the rocks. After the debriefing, we found out that the driver saw some car parts on the road, and probably also the attackers, but he couldn't communicate it to us. A bit late to the party, but what the hell, why not? I was sitting in the driver's seat of my Bradley at a traffic control point outside of Baghdad in 2003. I was bored, hot and hungry. Along came this kid. He's about 12. In one hand he's got a toy robot, and in the other a carton of cigarettes. He comes towards me yelling Mister, running low on cigarettes as I was. I dropped down inside my driver's hole to grab my wallet cause $5 for a carton of smokes is a great price. As I'm rooting around inside the Bradley, there's an earth-shattering boom and the Bradley rocked. I stuck my head out, and when the dust cleared there was a pair of shoes with feet still in them. I cleared my head and climbed out to check for damage and found a huge blood splatter on the side of the vehicle. As I stood there, looking at the remains of a preteen suicide bomber, the only thought that went through my head was disappointment at the loss of those cigarettes. It's very interesting how much of your humanity is lost during times of war. Mostly stuff like picking up body parts after an explosion, or watching strays run away with them. Killing people or animals for reasons that were kind of weird but justifiable. Basically my least favorite experiences that remind me what anyone is capable of when pressed beyond normal limits. My least favorite story is shooting someone up on a ridge. While we were getting mortared, we shot at them to pin them down until our airstrike arrived. It was a pretty casual setting. A few mortars were landing sporadically, none within kill range, and we were in armored vehicles anyways. We saw what looked like people launching mortars at us up on a ridge nearby, and there were obviously mortar shells landing around us. A village elder actually ran up to me and was yelling some shit. Our interpreter told me that he was saying that the people on the ridge were actually women doing some blasting. Obviously it wasn't believable, and we called in an airstrike. The faked up thing to my mind is that we could have easily just kept driving. Instead we parked inside a mortar attack to call in an airstrike. I'm pretty sure they were the ones mortaring us. It's just really weird in that it didn't seem like a dangerous situation at all, even with sporadic mortars landing within 100 meters or so. The whole thing is usually just so surreal that I never really took it seriously. I was the guy sunbathing naked on top of our HMMWV at the cop, or taking a bus in the middle of the road while people were shooting at us from far away. It wasn't that serious. The weirdest thing to me, I guess, is that despite being in quite a few firefights, I didn't really see the results of them. I was never in really close combat, and we mostly just got shot at while driving and returned fire. We would call in artillery or airstrikes on positions and shoot at people, and then just drive away down the road. I saw plenty of dead people, but very few that we actually killed. So despite shooting at people a fair amount, I really don't know for sure if I ever actually hit anyone. It's kind of a weird feeling. My uncle was a captain in the USMC in Vietnam. He was wounded twice in combat and received at least one Purple Heart. He sank into a deep depression near the end of the war as a result of guilt over the deaths of some of the men under his command. As PTSD wasn't even considered a real thing at the time, he did not receive an honorable discharge at war's end, and he dealt with severe depression for almost 3 decades after that. He told me the following story recently, as for many years he wouldn't speak about his experiences. He and his men had, after hard fighting and some casualties taken, captured a VC bunker. This was when the war was already going pretty badly, so the military jumped on it as an opportunity for good PR. One of the big brass, Brigadier General, I think, decided that my uncle and his chewed up unit, which had just gotten back to a safe staging zone, should escort the brass and a slew of reporters back out into hostile territory to have a photo op at the bunker he and his men had captured. On the way they were ambushed by the VC. First with mortars, and then engaged directly. 4 of his men died in the mortar attack, and 3 more in the firefight. He himself was wounded by mortars, nearly severed 2 of his fingers. In the middle of it all, the general, who was freaking out, came running up to my uncle, waving and shouting, "Captain! Captain!" at the top of his lungs. Already furious over the loss of his men on such a stupid and pointless mission, he got even madder at the fact that this idiot bigwig was loudly identifying an officer in the field for any enemy to target. His response, to snap to attention and fire off the crispest, most deferential salute he could muster, yelling "Yes sir, General sir," at the top of his lungs, to make sure that any enemy looking for a target would have no doubt who was the highest value target, and maybe do him a favor and put a bullet in the idiot. Sadly, no such luck. But the total waste of his men, that's what stuck with him most. I found out recently that he had been taking out a small ad in the Marine Corps magazine with the names of all the men who died under his command. For years and years. A few years ago, the military finally upgraded his discharge and awarded him all the back pay he was owed, and he used the money to travel to DC to see the memorial for the first time. It did him a world of good. So I'm a medic back stateside and work EMS. We get this call one night for an unconscious unknown. Dispatch has the wife on the phone, but she is in hysterics. We roll up on scene, and as we are walking in the front door, dispatch upgrades it to a full box and says it's a gunshot wound. I remember looking at my radio in a kind of shock. They always tell us scene safety comes first, and I'm standing in the entrance of a house where someone just shot someone. So I hear some commotion from the next room, kinda like a dining room area. Well, this guy is standing there with blood all over himself motioning us farther into the house. So I said, fuck it, I'm here already. My partner is already walking in the room I'm going to. There is this guy sitting at the table facing me making this horrible gurgling scream sound with his lower face just split in pieces. You could see where he had put the gun under his head and instead of pointing it straight up angled it forward. Load and go. We get this dude in the back and he is just out of it. I've got to hold his jaws wide since it's in 2 pieces so we can intubate him. We get the tube, while using fluids and one of the firefighters is driving like a bat out of hell to the nearest trauma center. Traumas in the back of a rig are hectic no doubt, but this one was a blur. Med after med, constant vitals, listening to make sure the tube is in place. But there was one instance where this dude comes out of it. For 10 seconds he is still, and he makes eye contact with me. Singular since the other rise out of its socket and we have it wrapped up. All I could see was regret. He just looked at me for 10 seconds. He blinked once, looked straight at the ceiling of the rig, and was unconscious anyways. We get him to the center and rush him in. Everyone is waiting for him. Biggest group of people and they take him to their bed and start working. We give report and we are walking back out again. My partner is standing at the back of the ambulance just staring in. There is blood everywhere, little chunks of red, some white pieces, shattered bone or teeth. And this young girl comes out and hands us 2 pairs of scrubs. She said thank you for your service and we changed right there in the ambulance bay. Most miserable ride back to station ever. Dude just got back from deployment, was a real dork operator as fuck, and had just found out his wife was faking other dudes and wanted a divorce. Drank himself into a stupor and shot himself in the head. I was stuck in a special circle of hell during Vietnam, known as a firebase. We had a lot of near overruns and all sort of crazy shit happen, but one thing always bothered me. Mortar pits would run into rounds that didn't go out after they hung, so we had deep ditches next to the pits to clear a hot round that hung. Guys get lazy and a lot of dead brass, 105 cans and other detritus of war get tossed in the pits. Local kids used to hop in the pits, if we didn't chase them off, to scrap brass and dead heads to make booby traps. I saw a kid run up and jump feet first into a pit. His body went below the sandbags and instantly it was like the sun crashed into my face. Then I was deaf. I looked up seconds later and his arm was on top of an APC. I remember at the time my only feeling was at least that shell didn't become a booby trap. Edit. Fuck my grammar hard enough to type this sheet without worrying about commas. I'm not a veteran, nor am I a soldier. But my grandfather was, and he never talked about the war. I never thought to ask. But, when he was older, and dying of cancer, I was sitting in his room, and we were playing gin rummy, as we often did. He looked up at me, and started telling me about his time in the military, Navy to be exact, and the good times he had had with his mates. But there was one thing he said, that he knew God would never forgive him for, and that he feared he would go to hell. He was crying at this point. He was always a very strong and emotionally controlled man, and I was shocked, and a little scared. He'd never cried before, that I'd seen. He carried on, and told me about the time his co ordered him to fire on a beach. He was given the area and he aimed the guns, but he noticed that, on the beach he was ordered to bomb, that there were women and children playing and living their lives. He questioned his co and apparently his co threatened him with a court-martial and ordered him, once again, to fire. He said that as he watched the beach, along with all the people on it, turn to dust and ash, he knew God would never forgive him, that he'd condemned himself to hell. Afterwards he said he was tired, and we ended the game early, but that story always stuck me. He never mentioned the war again to me. We talked a lot, and played gin many times, before he passed away. He was an awesome person. I know it doesn't really fit the question, but I figured I'd share. Anyways. I read a lot of shit on here, but I just made this account for this. I was in Iraq in 2005. I worked in reconnaissance, and did some door booting. I'd killed a few, shot a lot, helped kids, helped a lady give birth in a car, all kinds of weird shit you don't think happens in a war anyways. We were at an Iraqi army outpost eating lunch in our truck, and these 2 Iraqis were standing guard at the frontage road in trance about 200 yards away. I've always thought it was really interesting to watch people converse over there because they stand really close and gesticulate a lot. Well, this one guy asked the other guy for a cigarette, and when his buddy reached in his pocket, his axe snagged against his vest and went off, striking his buddy in the chest at point blank range. Me and my buddy watched it happen and thought they were playing around because the one guy flagged him with his rifle and then the other guy put both hands to his chest and fell backwards, almost comically. Then we heard the rifle report. I drove over and was thinking he has a plate carrier. He is probably just banged up. When I got out, I realized he was having trouble breathing. We sped back inside the compound with him, and I was checking him out. The bullet had gone through his plate and did a number on his insides. I could hear sucking and gurgling. He had blood in his lungs. He was staring at me and clutching my arm. His friend was wailing, "I'm sorry." I got his vest off and was going to apply a sucking chest wound bandage from the medic bag I had in my truck, but he started fading real fast. He passed out and stopped breathing. The medic finally made it through the crowd of IA soldiers that had gathered around. He dug into the guy and tried a few things, but nothing helped. This all happened in roughly 10 minutes. Sorry for the longest text assault. I've never told this story before. I still see that guy's eyes burrowing into me if I'll let my mind wander. My grandfather told me about the time he served in the British RAF during WW2. He was a navigator on a Lancaster bomber and did a lot of nighttime raids against German factories. He was returning one night from a mission when he ran into some friendly ACAC anti-aircraft fire and crashed into a English farmer's field. He ended up in an Air Force hospital with broken bones for several months. His crew were unscathed in the accident and were assigned to a notoriously dangerous pilot who kept losing his crew on previous missions. They unfortunately didn't survive the next mission, and Grandad had some serious post-war survivor's guilt because of it. He only really talked about it just before he died. I could tell he felt somehow responsible for their fate. But there was a silver lining to this story. My grandmother-to-be was working for the Royal Observer Corps in an early warning radar station at the time. She was partially responsible for directing the ACAC battery that accidentally shot him down. Having heard about the friendly fire incident, she took upon herself to visit him in hospital. A different kind of guilt. They hit it off and ended up getting married after the war. TLDR, grandma shot grandpa down. Turns out it's a valid pickup strategy. I worked with a manhunting element in Iraq. We were hunting a senior Al-Qaeda associate who was responsible for web-based communication facilitation. We brought in all the agencies, played super spy with his apartment, tracked all his movements. Months we did this. Finally, in one night we scooped up all his contacts, his family, everyone, 100 people in all. He, of course, was the primary, and we had a safe house set up just for him. One of the agencies had done up a personality profile to assist in the interrogations. My job was to plan a method of interrogation that would most likely lead to him disclosing the information we wanted. After months of hunting this guy, I was ready. That is, until I met him. He was not a hardened extremist or a veteran of the radical Islamic movement. He was more like me, a bit of a nerd, pretty dorky. And, most of all, scared. Another couple months rolled by. We traveled around Iraq observing areas he frequented before so as to positively identify people we were interested in. During the time I learned he was mostly into video games. His older brother was a super extremist who died fighting the Americans. Every day his parents reminded him that his brother was holy, but he was a coward because he'd rather play video games and work on computers. When they threatened to kick him out of his home, he finally went to Iraq, but his first assignment was to drive a car bomb toward a US checkpoint. He was forced to pray and agree. He drove the car toward the checkpoint, but, at the last moment, pulled into an alley, got out and ran away. When he was picked up again, he offered his services as a tech, and was put in charge of the online comms. He asked me one night if it was true that Christians in America ate their firstborn. We talked about religion and came to the conclusion that religion is just a way of looking at something that other religions are seeing too. We just see it differently. Sort of an all roads lead to Rome thing. During our time together we spent hours watching bridges, compounds, more hours in interrogation rooms, safe houses, helicopters, convoys, and prisons. Somewhere along the way I saw more than just a detainee. He was the person I spoke to the most downrange. In a lot of ways we were the same. When it came time to decide what path he would take after our time together, I was given two options. He be sent directly to the Iraqi courts for execution, or he be given the opportunity to be released to work as an informant. The risk in the informant was that he cold been bullshitting me the whole time. He could easily go back to the extremist activity and put other soldiers' lives at risk. I thought about the bond I had with other service members, how most of us came from shitty backgrounds joining the service for a better future, how our ambition to become better was what brought us together, that no matter what we were always going to have each other's backs. It was soldiers who taught me what it was like to love and belong. Then I thought about the time I spent with this detainee. He was no killer. He was scared of guns and hated Iraq. He wanted to go home. We laughed together. I remember him reaching out one night as we were pulled, via helicopter, out of a surveillance opus. I remember when we almost died together in a Humvee crash. I trusted him. I hated that choice. It was the last choice I made as a troop. I quit the next day, flew home, and haven't looked back since. I trusted him. But my trust was no match for the potential he still had to hurt those who had meant so much to me. I went to his cell, thanked him for his friendship, and gave him a hug. Then I recommended him for direct transfer to the Iraqi court system with the intent for immediate execution. I still throw up when I think about it. Then you come home, and you hear people want to know what it's like to go to war. You hear people parade you around without ever knowing the cost to your soul that shit takes. Every time someone thanks me for my service or calls me a hero, I die a little inside. 22 vets a day die by suicide. All we want is the opportunity to share our experiences in a way that helps make us all a little better. Thanks for opening the thread, means a lot. I still have nightmares because of this. I was with the 3/5 during the Second Battle of Fallujah. This was in the closing weeks of the battle. We were clearing a small sector of the city that had been hit by friendly artillery the previous night. Smoke, rubble, nothing ordinary for artillery shelling. We came across a couple of insurgents holding out in a small hut, surrounded by a couple of bodies. We figured, hey, the shelling must have taken out some stragglers that were unlucky enough to be outside. We secured the hut relatively easily. 2 badders died, 1 ran away. We were beginning to search those bodies that were outside when we saw what had really happened to them. They were burnt. Not a normal kind of burn. Their faces looked like they were melted. Any uncovered skin was burnt and mangled. We had seen burn victims numerous times, but none like this. 2 of my squad threw up. A third one had a panic attack. Then we came across one in particular. We kept checking bodies, and I turned one over that had been face down. It's a sight that no amount of alcohol will let me forget. His eyes were gooey, and part of his right eye had stuck to the ground when I flipped him over. His face was covered in blisters and melted skin. Patches of his beard were gone, and bloody parts of his skull were showing where his ear should have been. It got worse after that, but I don't want to recount it. I was still there until the end of the battle, when the Iraqis took over security of the city. My squad never really talked about what happened. We kept clearing parts of the city, and we never had another encounter like that. There were whispers here and there that we had used WP to shell the city insurgents, and the media went apeshit over it. It wasn't until the US officially admitted to it that we fully understood what had happened to those men we found. I was shipped home after my tour and got discharged with PTSD. I have a family now, but I still see that face when I close my eyes. This is the first time I've ever talked about it. It's the last I'll ever talk about it. At the time, it seemed like the right thing to do, but now looking back, it was pretty fucking cold-hearted and cruel. When I joined up, the army was in disarray. Discipline was low, morale was low, and the army was pretty much getting the dregs of society for recruits. There were some of us who wanted to be there, but it just seemed that a lot of soldiers joined because it was their last resort. I was saddened by the fact that we had E1s, privates, bringing home less than $600 a month trying to feed their family. Some of these guys were dirt faking poor, uneducated, and to be honest, not the brightest bulbs in the lamp point with great regularity. We, the more experienced soldiers, were ordered to shape these guys up and turn them into soldiers. Most were just not cut out for military life. They just joined because it was a job that they could qualify for, and they got pretty good benefits. The senior NCOs would have us basically beat and humiliate these poor bastards. I was a 23-year-old D5 telling a 35-year-old E2 what a piece of shit he was, a waste of an army uniform, and these guys would be crying because they knew they were just dumb hillbillies with no other options in life. I was basically ordered to break these guys down, and if they could be built back up to military standards, great. If not, they would be booted out and sent back to whatever hellhole they were trying to escape. It was tough seeing a man who was just faking broken, packing his sheet, and taking that long, slow walk to the waiting cab, and he had to tell his wife and children that he was kicked out. Once, we had a guy drink Brasso metal polish to try and kill himself. A couple of days later, his bunkmate blew his own brains out on the firing range because he got word that he was about to be kicked out. He had 2 kids and a wife. Another guy hung himself from the stair rail in the barracks. I personally blame the recruiters. These guys are soldiers, generally senior NCOs, and they know when someone is army material and when they are not. I'm not a soldier in any way, but this still haunts me. I was in Jerusalem during the Second Intifada in 2003, back when Hamas was trying to win, and hearts and minds through suicide bombings. Or something. I don't know. Politics in Israel are insane. Riding a bus then was incredibly hair-raising. Hamas was blowing buses up at random, and bombings typically had no survivors. You had to do it, but you literally spent the entire time wondering, should I get off here, just to be safe? One more stop. I can't count the number of times I got off early, just because of that creeping paranoia. Is it paranoia, if it's actually justified? Anyway, one morning I was riding the bus in a complete sheen of sweat, and the old man beside me noticed. He chuckled at me and told me to calm down, it would be fine. He told me he had survived the Holocaust as a little boy, and the War of 68 and the War of 73 as a grown man, and fear was just a thing you had to learn to live with. See life anyway. Smile. Laugh. He had this great voice. Somewhere between the old Jewish guys in New York City and a news announcer. The sort of voice that could just calm you down. Pretty soon, he had me chatting and laughing, and I almost entirely forgot my fear. When my stop arrived, I actually wanted to stay on an extra stop or 2. But I got off. And this being the thread it is, you'll be unsurprised to read how that bus exploded about 3 blocks later. I ran after it, but the police were already pushing people back, and besides the heat was too bad to get close. I have no idea if he was still on it or not. 17 people died in that attack. No one ever claimed credit, and so far as I know, to this day they all died for nothing. Worse, an acquaintance who worked with the Israeli Emergency Response Services told me that buses aren't really heavy vehicles, and they tend to absorb the shock of the explosion. The victims of those bombings weren't blown up, they either burned to death or died from having their seat forcibly shoved up their rectums. I remember that old man and hope he got off. No one should die that way. People like to say war is hell, but that's too grand. It's just a waste. I lost a friend/coworker to suicide about 6 months ago. There were some allegations and he and his wife were separated to keep things safe. The night he killed himself he was asking around for a computer to use that night to do his schoolwork. I didn't want him at my apartment because I didn't want to drive him home, and I didn't really have my apartment clean for guests. The following day he didn't show up to work. I kept asking around thinking perhaps he just didn't want to show today. Our master sergeant goes to check in on him. Around 1300 our director pulls us in and tells us he was found dead and that it looks like an apparent suicide. 12 years in the army, 3 deployments and lost many friends before. The first time a death completely shut me down. I still what if myself and partially blame my selfishness for his death. I may have been able to keep him alive one more day, or he may have said something that triggered me into helping. He was off but he never seemed that off where it threw up red flags. A few months after his death I was still really angry and coming out of a bad depression from it and realized I can't live this life anymore. It has hollowed me out and I can't deal with it. So after 13 years next year I'm out and going to pursue a life that will hopefully bring more meaning and heal the wounds that never show point. Miss you my friend. See you on the final drop zone one day to share a beer. I had a friend in Afghanistan. He had a squad leader and team leader he hated. They treated him like a human cheat, a slave. Anything anyone needed done, he had to do it. Every time. The worst things. At the worst times. Just got back from 48-hour ops outside the wire. He'd be on the first guard shift, followed by cop beautification. On guard, with me, he was open about everything he felt about them and himself. He had opened up to me several times about how he wanted to come in with his SAW M249, if you don't know, into their tent and blast them all away. As in, Hassan Nadal style. Seriously. We both had terrible senses of humor, just the same, and even I could tell it wasn't a joke. I basically said, hey man, they aren't all bad, but I hate them too. Just don't do it, cause I care about you enough that the rest of this would be hell for me without you. You're my only friend. He also said about how he'd off himself if it got worse, and side comments like I won't have to pull guard where I'm going, or we won't need to worry about etc where I'm going, i.e. suicide. Those, I suppose, were more like jokes. I would always say, don't say that shit man, we need you here. I'd have a bad time with it if you offended yourself, or everyone would miss you, think what people would think, you got a purpose, etc. I never know if I handled the situation right or not. I always feel bad about it. Point FYI, he got out of the army and is doing great from what I understand. Not me, an old cowwalker, not even sure if it's true. Point anyways, it's a great story, so I'll tell you all about it. I guess my cowwalker was leading a patrol in Iraq during what I think he said was the Gulf War. While out on patrol, the guy up top on the gun spotted something quite odd in the binoculars and told them he was seeing the golden arches of McDonald's. Thinking the sun was baking his mind, he told him to come down and take a break, but the gunner insisted he take a look. So he obliged, and sure as hell there they were, as if they were back in the States. Naturally they plotted out where it was on a map, and to their surprise it was just over the border in Saudi Arabia. Now they were on strict orders not to go into Saudi Arabia, but the men couldn't resist getting their burger on. So he radioed the trucks in his company to convince on the McDonald's. When they got there, I guess no one spoke English, so they ordered by pointing to the pictures, and then retreated back to Iraq to have a feast. Needless to say, I guess every man that gorged themselves that day got sick from eating their first junk food in months. To this day I have no idea if the story is true or not, but it is fun to hear and think about how a company of men invaded Saudi Arabia for McDonald's. I was on QRF and all of a sudden things went nuts. One American checkpoint was calling for help, then another, then everybody in our sector. We responded as fast as we could to each checkpoint, one after another, holding the insurgents from being able to assault our positions. When the smoke cleared, we found out that every position in our sector was attacked simultaneously. We established comms with each checkpoint, making sure everyone was okay, people had enough ammo, etc. Then we got word that our partner Iraqi checkpoint wasn't responding to radio checks. We tried them over and over. No response. Command dispatched us again to go check it out. It was a long road out in the middle of nothing. Pure desert like you imagine it to be. We knew from the black smoke billowing on the horizon what happened before we even got there. The insurgents wiped it out. They attacked all our positions to tie up our air assets as a diversion, then wiped the Iraqi checkpoint off the face of the earth. When we pulled up to the end of the checkpoint, there was brass on the road from one end to the other. Thousands upon thousands of rounds were fired. The insurgents didn't spare a single man. Every last soldier at the checkpoint was killed. It wasn't the worst carnage I saw by far, but it was graphic. It wasn't that bothered me though. I stared at the carnage for about a solid minute after we cleared it and verified there were no survivors. Then I looked behind me at the other side of the road. Far off in the distance, maybe 400 meters away, there was a farmer, tilling his field. His kids were with him, playing as he tilled. I looked back at the carnage, looked back at the man, and that was the moment I knew there was no God. Here these men were, these soldiers, just minutes ago, fighting for their lives, dying violently in war 400 meters away, literally 400 meters. It's playtime, and the world didn't care. It was just the craziest juxtaposition I've ever seen. Irreconcilable. I might be too late. I had just gotten to Iraq. My first pump, so I was excited. We just got to our fob and started relieving the unit who was there before us. One night I got woken up and we all had to go to a meeting with our co and first sergeant. I was annoyed at first because sleep is hard enough to get there without this kind of thing. There was a squad leader from the other unit playing the stupidest game I've ever heard of with one of his boots. New Marine. He held his unloaded pistol to the new Marine, locked the slide back, and asked, "Do you trust me?" Obviously the new guy would say yes, because you just don't say no to your higher ups in fear of getting faked with for hours/days/a week. Then he slides a magazine into the pistol. This is called the trust game. What is supposed to happen is you send the slide forward before the mag is inserted all the way. Well, he didn't. He pulled the trigger and shot the new guy in the head. This happened maybe 30 feet away from me while I was sleeping. This guy was just a week or two from going home to see his family. We had a ceremony for him and videotaped it for his family. It's very strange to be a part of something like that. Even while I never knew this guy, I was still very upset over it. It's weird how it still affected me enough to think about it every day or two. Boredom really does make you do stupid shit. Not military, but I deployed with military troops as a member of Doctors Without Borders into Ghazni. I was assigned to army personnel to keep an eye on me since we were in an active combat zone and I was a civilian. We got a call one day from my boss where there had been an IED explosion. We went as fast as possible to get there, trying not to run over people. We got to the explosion. It was a civilian van. A man and his family had been inside, and his 3 daughters and 4 sons were all inside, charred, blackened, and blown to bits. The smell was horrendous. I thought they were all dead when I got there, till I heard a little girl crying. She was under a pile of the other corpses and body parts, burnt very badly, and missing a hand. We did our very best. She only lasted an hour, the most excruciating, torturous hour in existence. She screamed at the horror, the pain from every touch and motion, and it was the most heartbreaking noise I had ever heard. It stays with me to this day. But the silence stays with me more. When she stopped crying, she was dead, and the silence was deafening. Shortly thereafter, insurgents came up on us, shot my guards and my boss, but not me. I, being the only woman in the deployment, was dressed in a burqa and wearing dark contacts to hide my American heritage. They thought I was one of those and started to drag me off with them. I would have been raped, then murdered when they discovered I was American if my guards hadn't been shot in their flak vests and not been injured as I thought. They retaliated and saved my life. I will never be able to repay them. No one knows but us, and we will never tell a soul. There's a reason I left healthcare and went to a happier profession. My story isn't that intense, and I don't not talk about it. My job isn't on the front lines. More of an enabler job. I fix jets. If a jet is set to take off for a certain mission and has a maintenance issue, it's called Red Bull maintenance. Basically, get the fuck out of my way. I'll do the paperwork later type sheet to get the mission done. One day we are busting as on this Red Bull in the 100+ degree heat. Jet doesn't get fixed. Mission goes late. Fail. The next day we are formed up for roll call and we do our usual bit. Then our chief comes marching, looks us in the eyes, and tells us that we killed 16 Marines because we failed to get the mission done in time. I couldn't help but think of what the tick scenario was. A bunch of guys hunker down waiting for sweet freedom to rain down from the heavens, but it never came. Then the 16 families that have a piece of them missing now. We never not talk about it because fuck that guy, right? I hate reading this stuff. But it is good that fellow soldiers and those who've served on the civilian side can share their pain and grief. My counselor friend says this Reddit thing is a good thing to share experiences and experience some sense of humanity through learning of the vast human experiences that are shared and displayed here. My own experiences in active service and even currently as a contractor have been gut-wrenching at the worst and soul-bearing uplifting at the best of times. I've seen good men killed before my eyes, taken much too soon for their time, and innocents killed for next to no reason, and for worst, for none. I've done my share of it, and for each I pray forgiveness from them, their families, their gods, and my God. For those I was made to kill, I remember equally as those that weren't by these hands, but by the conflict I was in. Peace be to all fellow soldiers, brothers, and sisters in arms, fallen comrades, and the families of all that support us, and forgive us for what we have done. I honestly don't know if I ever told this story to anyone. I don't think I have, but maybe. Anyway, some context. I was a brand new snuffy in the 82nd Airborne when we deployed to Saudi Arabia in August 1990. I had quite literally been in my first unit for 3 days when we went to war. Didn't even know the names of the guys in my squad except my roomie and one other guy. I went overnight from being in a training unit to being handed an M60 and 75 pounds of ammo, then being crammed on a plane, and one of the first couple hundred troops on the ground for what we would later learn, and laugh our asses of at the name of, was called Operation Desert Shield. Seriously, to us the name was a total joke at first. Anyway, I could tell you all kinds of stories, some silly, some depressing, some inspiring, but the one that always comes back to me when people ask about what I remember from my time over there was the very first morning. We were in some decrepit air defense base, pretty sure it had been abandoned for years. There was a sort of courtyard in the middle with a chest-high brick wall beside the latrines. The first morning there, we filled our canteen cups from the latrines and were shaving. I put my cup on the wall and was shaving when this skinny ass kitten jumped up on the wall and started checking my shaving cup out. I finished shaving and petted the cat for a bit, poured out my nasty shaving water and gave the cat some fresh water. It was possibly the friendliest cat I've ever met, and I'm a cat person. The officer in charge of things said, "Well, Snow, we've been in the country for less than 12 hours and you already found a little pussy." I laughed because I was sort of expected to, and I guess it was witty. But I knew I wouldn't see the cat again. And I didn't. I still remember it and always wondered what happened to it. I know it's weird that amongst all the other shit that went down there, I spent over 8 months in that place, and all the other much more and less human stories I could tell. Ask me about playing DD on an old cable spool outside a tent in the desert in 1990 sometime. That's the one that always comes back to me. An old coworker of mine was deployed in the Middle East for a time. After we had worked together for a time, he told me the story of how he got sent home. Fair warning, this isn't my story. I know next to nothing about the military, and I heard this story a little over 3 years ago. I'm positive I will get aspects of this story wrong, so forgive me. For the purpose of this story, I will refer to my co-worker as Elliot. Now, Elliot was deployed somewhere in the Middle East, and his job was to usher civilians through checkpoints. One day, just like any other day, he is doing his job when a mother and her son walk up to the checkpoint. Elliot talks to the mother and doesn't really pay the child any mind. The boy is only about 6 or 7 and is busy playing in the sand. About a minute into talking with this woman, he feels a pressure on his thigh and then hears yelling behind him. Elliot looks down at this leg and sees a knife. The boy, no older than 7, had stabbed Elliot in the leg, and while Elliot watched, the boy dragged the knife, still in Elliot's leg, downwards. This young boy had split Elliot's thigh wide open. Luckily, Elliot survived, and the only physical injury he came back with was a limp. Mentally, he came back with severe PTSD, a fear of crowded places, and thoughts of suicide. He overcame his PTSD and suicidal thoughts, but he is still afraid of crowds. Oddly enough, I met Elliot through coaching children. This isn't my story, so I can't possibly imagine what Elliot went through. I've tried for 3 years, but I can't. What could possess a child to do that? And how can someone even come back from an experience like that? A junior officer in my unit beat his wife to death, then nearly decapitated her with a blunt hunting knife. Sharp ones were around. Her son was in the next room over and heard it all, but the officer sent him to school the next day anyway. He was used to hearing his mom get beat up by this and all her previous husbands, so he didn't think anything of it. I had to go in after and catalog all of their possessions. He used a .300 Magnum to kill himself, and his brains were in 2 corners of the room. Pieces of his scalp clung to a nearby mirror and skull fragments were in the ceiling. The wall behind their bed looked like a Jackson Pollock painting. One day, I accidentally kicked a piece of his skull with my boot. It was on the floor and I hadn't seen it. At that point, it didn't bother me anymore. I had to call for over 2 weeks for people to come in and clean up the mess. By that point the blood started to ferment and smell sweet. Just so many faked up things all wrapped into one. I was part of a civil military cooperation (CIMIC) team in southern Afghanistan. Part of our duties involved making nice with local dignitaries. This one guy we visited was a middling ranked officer in the local police, nephew to a provincial governor and all-round piece of shit. He was arrogant, sleazy, and corrupt to his eyeballs. We had to stop taking along our female CIMIC team members because he kept trying to sleaze onto them. We were told to play nice though, as he was being groomed as an intelligence source point on one of our social visits. We were in the guy's living room sipping chai. We see this little boy come out of a side room, no more than 11 to 12 years old, looking scared as shit. Before I could speak to the boy though, one of the guard/servants came out and literally dragged the kid out by the neck. I never wanted to kill anyone as badly as I did at that moment. I don't think I have to tell you guys what small boys in Afghanistan get used for that sight. It still angers me to this day. Of course I reported the incident to our chain, but we all knew what the score was. I had no direct evidence apart from that one fleeting glance, and the asshole was too important and too connected to jeopardize a relationship with him. Fact that place and fact politics. I was an Apache helicopter weapons tech. While deployed to Iraq, we operated out of one hard, concrete and girders, main hangar and several soft, basically canvas and aluminum tubes, clamshells. My battalion primarily worked in the main hangar. Theoretically, despite the dilapidated condition of the main hangar, built by the Iraq military decades prior, it offered some protection from mortar fire and small arms in the unlikely event the perimeter was breached. Anyway, my platoon sergeant had tasked me out to assist another platoon working out of the clamshells, and I started over there, about 200 yards of a walk. I realized about halfway there that they didn't have the badass freezer we had in my shop that kept our water ice cold, since lukewarm water in 125-degree heat is pretty sheety. I turned around to get a few bottles. No sooner had I reached the hangar did a concentrated barrage of mortars start landing all over the flight line. We had had plenty of sporadic and poorly aimed bouts of mortars before, 2 or 3 impacts spread out over a large area. This was leaps and bounds over that point. After the all clear was given, we went out to survey the damage and render aid. Most of it hit the flight line, and a few in our housing area, but a couple directly impacted the clamshell I was heading towards. There were many injuries, and a few fatalities, including some troops I knew personally. It unnerved me a bit, because I knew, if I hadn't turned around to get a cold drink, I would have been one of those casualties. It wasn't a question of if I was a casualty, it would have been a question of how bad of one. I had been mortared before, I'd been shot at, both on the ground and in the air, but I considered that my first, and only, brush with death during deployment. Late to the party, and it is not my story, but my grandfather's. He fought with Patton's 3rd Armored through Europe back in WWII. Finally got him to write some memoirs a few years back, but he never really mentioned any combat, always glossed over it, never wanted to bring up those memories. Last month, I was helping him finish clearing out his basement, and we got to talking about the war, and he told me a story that he had never told anyone, even my grandmother. I was on the front line, retaking some small town in France, I don't remember where. I came around a bend in the road and ran right into a crowd. I don't know which of us was more surprised. My rifle jammed, so I couldn't shoot him, and I did the only thing I could think of. I charged him with my knife. Don't know how he didn't get me with his gun, but as I was charging him, I forgot everything. I couldn't think of my mother's face. I couldn't even think of Janice's face, my grandmother. It was just me and him. And God help me, I killed him right there, face to face, with my knife in some town I don't even remember the name of. Only time I've ever seen my grandfather cry, and it really helps put into perspective why he never wanted to talk about the war. He had a stroke 2 days later. And as far as I know, I'm the only person he ever told that story to. Throw away for obvious reasons. My best friend is the only Marine from his fire team who didn't receive a Purple Heart. He was attached to an army unit on a bumfuck nowhere checkpoint, and to his relief, all 30 of them died in a heli crash. Rotor flew off due to sand degradation, officially. So while he was on post for 3 solid days, his fire team went out on a mission and had a grenade dropped in their transport. Squad leader lost his arm. All the others were killed. He got back from post, saw their mangled asses, had a complete faking meltdown, killed a bunch of enemy combatants, and went into psych for a bit. And a fake. He's told only me all of the details about this, and when we lived together, after he got back, he would frequently wake me and our other roommate up with his sleep screaming pointed. Finds disheartening to hear the toughest faking guy you know trying to save people who've been dead 8 years while he's unconscious. I was on one of the first teams in Afghanistan in 2001. We were out pretty much on our own the majority of the time we were in the country and had multiple standoffs. I had RPGs pointed at me, lots of ACs, not to mention the stink eye from quite a few people. One time, we were given targets by our warlord and had a bunch of F-18s overhead waiting to drop bombs. We served over 3,000 Afghans at a makeshift clinic. We helped dispose of a bunch of unexploded ordnance, mortar rounds, artillery rounds, etc. After a truck blew up in town under questionable circumstances, I share a lot of my stories with people, but the thing I rarely share is that we never dropped a bomb, I never fired a shot, and never killed a soul. And the memory that actually sticks with me in slow motion is of having my weapon on fire and having a guy in my sights ready to kill if anything went down. It is weirdly kind of embarrassing that going through all of that I came home with all of my rounds. Iraq. We were called out to go retrieve a downed bird. We jumped into our LMTVs and rushed out to get this aircraft. Along the way we saw a dead animal alongside the road. We didn't think much of it and kept on trucking. Then it hit. The first blast, then the second one. 2 IEDs were tripwired together in a dead animal. The truck in front of us was hit with the first one. The second one is us. Everyone in the front truck was completely filled with nails, broken glass, metal. You name it. But nobody was killed. Thank God 2 of the 3 soldiers lost body parts, and we had to retrieve them. The explosive that hit our truck wasn't too strong, so we walked away with a bent bumper and blown tire. But this was a traumatic experience for me being 18 and on my first deployment. I'd never experienced anything like the horror I felt when I saw that first truck get hit. When you're running over to it thinking you have 3 dead friends, brothers, that you will have to watch be put into the ground. It's a scary world out there, and people do sick things. My dad was in Vietnam. He was one of those young punks who had to choose between war and prison, so he thought he'd choose the easy way, and went into the Marines. He was a seriously faked up man growing up and probably a sociopath to some degree. That war mentally killed him. He would tell us stories at bedtime when we were still tiny. My mom had to leave him for all of our safety when I was 5. He spent most of my childhood in San Quentin. The story that sticks out most to me isn't any of the ones he told me, but the one my grandma told me when I was an adult. At some point he came back home from 3 years in Vietnam with a full-blown addiction and what can only be severe PTSD. He couldn't function above the level of a 5-year-old mentally for months. So he stayed with his mom and she took care of him. One night after a particularly bad nightmare, he told her about the rural Vietnamese girl he dated there. She had a daughter. The Viet Cong took the baby and quartered her live in front of the mother. The mother brought him the body and he gave her money for a funeral. I can't confirm if this is true or not, but from what my grandma told me, he certainly believed it to be true. I forgave him for a lot of shit after hearing that. Poor faker. There used to be this girl stateside I hung out with for a while. She was cool and a great cook, so it worked. She had a brother. Nice guy. He was in the army. I think it was a tradition for males to serve in the army in that family point anyway. Fast forward to a year later. I'm deployed to an undisclosed location in Southwest Asia. I work on the flight line loading aircraft. One of the things we load are transfer cases, the boxes we ship the dead home in. I have to admit that I put it out of my mind. It was cargo, just like anything else. I have to admit that I actually found the ramp freeze that we did while we were moving the bodies annoying point. So one day I'm on Facebook and I see a post from the girl I used to hang out with. Her brother is dead. Guess he was deployed the same time I was. Later that week I got the brief from Attic about the transfer cases. They had a special name, but I can't remember it. Coming in. He's one of them. We did everything the same as usual, but this time it's different. This wasn't just cargo. I knew this guy. I drank with this guy. And now he was dead, and I was holding his coffin. I guess that humanized the whole thing for me. Point. I never talked to that girl again. Don't know why. I just didn't. Moved on, I guess. I saw a lot of shitty things while I worked that port, but that one is the one that changed me and how I saw things over there. War is a shitty thing. Even those of us in support positions who never see the gory details can end up affected by it. This wasn't me, but my great uncle. He had a journal that this story was kept in and no one knew it had happened until after he passed away. He was stationed in Vietnam and there was a young girl, maybe 10 or 11, that always used to spend time with the soldiers. They would give her treats and drinks and stuff like that. One day they were at their base and the girl showed up. This was a little unusual, since he usually saw her off base. On this day she was wearing a backpack. My uncle was with his commander while she was coming closer. He was yelling to stop, in fear of what was in the backpack. She got closer and closer, smiling the whole time. The commander ordered my uncle to shoot her. My uncle refused to do it, and the commander shot her right in front of him. In the backpack there were colored in pages from a coloring book that she was going to give to the soldiers, along with some other toys. My uncle carried that inside for his whole life. I was a predator sensor operator for damn near the entire Iraq war. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. I've seen HVTs jump off buildings trying to avoid being captured in a raid. One guy hurt himself pretty badly. Funny story. I've spent months following one guy around Iraq, caught IED places in the act, and killed people who were no direct threat to me. Not even the same continent. I had a bird's eye view of the battle for Fallujah. I've watched friendless and enemies die. I've been cleared to engage what turned out to be US forces. We figured it out before we launched a missile, thankfully. I've never been happier. I listened to my gut. I put a hellfire on somebody that was getting ready to pray to Allah, maybe to thank him for surviving another encounter with American forces. I'll never know. The thing that sticks out is the dude who faked a goat. The jacked up thing is I'm pretty sure it was his neighbor's goat. I feel like the worst thing that I haven't really ever said was that I don't feel haunted or upset about the things I've seen or had to do. I feel pretty much nothing about it as far as self, although I can speak and feel with sincere humanity and compassion about them. I feel a slight confused guilt about the fact that I don't feel specifically damaged. Thus far, my working theory is that I guess I've just got warrior's blood, and I came into that part of my life already having an understanding of the humanities of war and combat. My older brother and I served 2 deployments together. He went in when I was 12, and he's still into retirement. Both airborne infantrymen in a unit that Petraeus referred to as the most lethal battalion in Iraq during the period we were there. This comment was made face to face with my company commander in front of our humble company nearing the end of our 15-month hold in a particular city in northern Iraq. We saw direct combat near weekly and sustained enemy mortar attacks nearly inside about every 2 weeks. Some significant incidents were the stuff of gossip legend around other bases that we interacted with or traveled through, leave, medical, supply, etc. My brother and I don't lose an ounce of sleep over our experiences. I'll give a non-combat story too. I was serving on a funeral detail while stationed at Feet Hood TX with 4th ID. This was after my own deployment, and while 1st Cav was deployed, we did funerals all over TX, mainly in the Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio area, probably 1 or 2 a week, mainly for elderly vets dying of old age, but a few active duty ones, not necessarily combat related, though there were a few. While the detail was kind of a sham job, because if we weren't doing a funeral, we were training for them, we were sent home. When we actually did them, we took them very seriously. One particular active duty funeral was a combat death from a 1st Cav troop from Lubbock TX. It was tough to do, because hundreds of people turned up for this thing. 4th ID sent a 1-star general as a representative. He had nothing to do with the detail. Multiple news agencies filmed at the cemetery, a major event. What was really tough was the guy's brother was also in the army, serving as a drill sergeant somewhere, having his own time downrange, hard-looking SSG, kept it together for most of the ceremony. But he asked to be involved in the detail. Because of the timing and other intricacies of the detail, we could only let him help fold the flag that was draped on the casket. Unfortunately, his emotions finally got the best of him, and he broke down and screwed up the folding of the flag. I had seen family members lose it before, but this was especially tough to watch. Because he was a fellow soldier, I also got a bit depressed as the months went on, and I did so many elderly vets' funerals, guys who served in WWII or Korea, because there would be like 2 people at the burial, most coming out of nursing homes. I felt bad that it seems these guys died alone, no family or friends at their side. This could get lost, but this happened to a buddy of mine. It was in Afghanistan around 2005, I want to say. Anyway, my buddy had a job where he drove and shot tanks. I don't know what the profession is called, but it's under artillery, I believe. On this particular day he was tasked to drive a truck instead, and there was a tank in front of him. The tank eventually hit an IED, and it engulfed the whole vehicle into flames. It was so bad that the flames welded the hatch shut, so the artillerymen operating the tank couldn't even get out. My buddy said he heard their screams writhing in agony, and there was nothing he could do. Eventually the fire got put out, but not for a while. On the next day, he was tasked to clean the insides of the burnt tank along with his buddy. They wore masks, because what was left was the cremation of their brothers who had died, along with some charred up body parts. Tears ran downwards along their face for the whole day as they spent cleaning the tank up. War is faked up, to say the least. I'm not a soldier, so not entirely within the guidelines of the question, but it reminded me of something. My grandfather fought in Europe during WWII, where he was a tank commander that fought in battles like the Battle of the Bulge, where he received the Silver Star. He died when I was fairly young, so I never really got the chance to ask him questions about his time in WWII, but my grandfather had talked with my dad a fair amount about the things he saw and things he did. However, the one subject that my grandfather would never so much as speak a word about was anything related to the concentration or death camps. Anytime anyone tried to ask him whether he saw any, he would apparently get this faraway haunted look in his eyes. That would be the end of the conversation. Till the day he died, my grandfather never said whether he had seen something, but my father is almost convinced that my grandfather saw something from the Holocaust that horrified him. Not sure what, though. He also hated the French. Okay, so after 9/11 and the Afghanistan aftermath, I was deployed in the beginning of the Iraq War. Mostly I was a mechanic for transport vehicles and minesweepers, and never saw a lot of combat experience, but a few things really nailed home how badly shit was faked up there. So in the beginning there were times where we're sitting there in the back of our vehicles hitting bumps and thinking, what the fuck, the Iraq road infrastructure is awful, at least make a flat road for fuck's sake. But then one day, and several days after, I got to ride shotgun pretty much. The bumps were actually people. In the beginning of the invasion, people would crowd the streets. Military policy was to not slow down when under possible attack. The front of the convoy honked and everything, but civilians still got hit and were crushed under the entire convoy. Being in the front vehicle in a convoy a few times after the initial invasion is something I'll never forget, even though I wish I could. You simply could not stop at an intersection, because you never knew when you'd get blindsided by an RPG. Those children that you might have seen in those liberating Iraq news clips, they were real. but we probably ran over a ton of them shortly after the initial invasion. I directly remember an instance where children were run in front of our transport, but some of them were run over because we didn't stop due to a threat in our area. It was the same bumps I felt in the back of the convoy. I may be late, but this isn't my story, but my dad was in the Air Force during the Vietnam War and was in a crew that was in one of those C-130 Hercules planes that carried supplies and fresh soldiers to front lines deep in the jungle and would bring back the wounded and dead from the front lines. During one supply run with about 100 plus fresh out of boot camp soldiers, he met some guys that he had grown up with and gone to school with. They chatted it up and talked about meeting after they got back to the States. The plane landed and dropped everything off, picked up some dead soldiers and headed back to the main airport. About 5 months later, my dad and his crew went on a supply drop to a different place and the plane had to take back about 50 to 70 dead soldiers. While loading, he noticed one of the guys he chatted with on the supply drop 5 months ago and asked him how he was doing. The guy was obviously shaken up, according to my dad. The guy then said that the unit he was in was ambushed. Only 2 guys made it out. None of the guys my dad grew up with made it out. My dad had to load the bodies of the 3 guys he had just talked to 5 months ago. My wife and I have a no secrets rule. As long as it's not classified material, she knows what's going on in my head. And that's a good way to prevent being a statistic. But there's one story I haven't shared. Stress acts on people in strange ways. Weeks on end in a shithole where everyone around you is struggling just as much. Some people just can't take it. There was this one kid, barely 18, who had been doing just fine for some time. He was an under the radar type, just skating by, doing his job, and not getting singled out for anything. One night I rolled over to relieve some back pain and he's sitting up in his bunk. I watched as he slowly removed the cap of his red lens light and one by one ate the batteries, even chewing them slowly, before swallowing and moving on to the next. I woke up the next day thinking it was some weird dream, until he pulled out a broken tooth at morning chow. He was shipped home for unrelated reasons a few weeks later. I'll never forget the biggest battery eating grin on his face. Like pure ecstasy. I'll never forget, because it reminds me that there are battles being fought that nobody sees, and you really have to watch your buddy's back, even after the battle's over. My father-in-law served in Vietnam and told myself, my wife and mother-in-law about some of it one night after we had a couple drinks. Him and several of his buddies were playing cards one night and he left early to go to bed, even after they all ragged him about leaving early. 10 minutes later a mortar hit where they were at and all that were there died. He was assigned perimeter guard manning a M60 one night. Sounds were heard and he and another M60 gunner opened fire and the sounds stopped. Next morning they found a couple Viet Cong bodies. At this point he broke down crying. He said neither gunner knew who killed them, but it was almost like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't him. I think he knew he did. My wife said that's the most detailed, vivid story she's ever heard him tell about the war. My wife is 32. My father-in-law said he thinks he has PTSD, but never got diagnosed or treated. I know he has many more stories to tell. I used to work for a crusty and illiterate company sergeant major who had unfortunately lost the ability to communicate with other human beings on any meaningful level. Everything with him was a one-way discussion and the only word in edgewise you could get is the compulsory yes sir. This was particularly evident every day around noon when he would phone the restaurant and have them deliver the exact same thing every day, a chicken sandwich, fries, and a Coke. Except after ordering the same food for the better part of a decade he would just dial the number, wait for them to pick up, and then proceed to yell the word chicken, chicken, into the phone and hang up, and they would deliver it. This is the same sergeant major who brought me up on charges for leaving a light on after I had left the room, and charged my immediate supervisor for wearing 2 different kinds of socks. I shit you not. So in his retirement year, just to fuck with him, I called his favorite chicken place every now and then to yell the words chicken, chicken, into the phone. They would deliver the sandwich and he would absolutely lose his mind. He'd yell at the delivery guy like he was one of his soldiers, and eventually they had enough of his shit. So for the longest time he just didn't eat and would just smoke at lunch. Export a green, filterless, which are particularly disgusting. One day I decided to phone his lonely little office during his last month of work. He picked up the phone and answered with his usual greeting, "What?" So I cheerfully said, "Hello." And he said, "Hello, hello. Who is this?" So I said, "Chicken," and promptly hung up. Not my story, but my dad is a doctor, not military medic, and he told me a war story that one of his veteran patients told him. This guy fought in Vietnam and was pretty messed up from the sheet that went on point. So this man and his unit were going through the jungle making sure villages were clear. At this point many villages were outwardly abandoned, but still were occupied by the enemy hiding inside or nearby. One village they encountered still seemed empty after being searched, and they were about to move on when somebody spotted an unusual tree line overlooking the village. The trees were in a straight line and too close together to be natural. Upon closer inspection, they found that the trees were concealing the entrance to a cave. They were sure that they had found a VC idiot. The man and his unit hadn't heard any reaction from whomever was inside, so they still seemed to have the element of surprise. My dad's patient was the one to roll a grenade in through a crack in the trees, and when it detonated they lit up the cave with gunfire. When everything settled, the men saw the bodies of the women and children of the village strewn about the cave point. This man now has dreams every night of Jesus telling him, "Kill yourself, kill yourself, kill yourself." War is faked. I was an AF medic. I treated and took care of veterans of all ages and branches of service that had served from WW1 Operation Desert Storm, not to mention other actions and operations. At age 21, I worked on an oncology ward for 1 year, and that's when I realized that suicide was always an option in the event of the big cancer. We averaged 3 patient deaths per week on this unit. We'd see some walk onto our unit, talking, laughing, no different than you or me today. 3 months later, they'd be a human bag of bones, pumped up full of narcotics to ease the pain. We'd wonder which would give up first, their families or their bodies. One patient was in such pain that we had to medicate him before placing a sheet on him. The weight of a sheet would make him cry out in pain. We had another patient, and this is the story that I'm sharing tonight. We'll call him Mr. Beauregard. He had fought the Japanese hand-to-hand on Iwo Jima. I came into his room one Friday night as I started my rounds. He told me that he wanted to say goodbye. His doctor had written him a weekend pass, and that he wouldn't be returning from his pass. He knew he was terminal, and he hated how his wife had to suffer watching him die day by day. He told me that where he lives, there's a stretch of highway, and on that stretch of highway is a curve, and on that curve is a tree. He said, people are always missing the curve, and dying when they hit the tree. This weekend, I'm taking out that tree. My death will be quick. My wife will collect what little bit of insurance there will be, and she can get on with her life, and won't have to suffer, watching me suffer. I just wanted to tell you, and thank you for the great way you took care of me and my family. Well, goodbye. And with that I was dismissed. I went into the whole bathroom, sat down and cried. I knew he was one of the bravest men I had ever met. I knew I wouldn't rat him out. It was his life, and he was rational, and had planned it all out. I spent the weekend in a drunken stupor, and when I came to work on Tuesday night, they told me that Mr. Beauregard had died over the weekend in a car accident. I was an AFCOP, and for those that don't know, it's an undermanned MOs. I chose it, but too many that I served with had enlisted open general and had been assigned it. They quite obviously didn't want the job. All Chair Force BS aside, my enlistment was filled with 12 to 14-hour shifts stateside, FTX and deployments. The assigned were always less than thrilled. Fast forward to Iraq/Afghanistan. I deployed a little in the early days, but then was sidelined by an undiagnosed genetic heart condition. Eventually I was medically retired. I was already pissed. I loved my job and serving. Then I caught reports of those I served with that had died on deployment, often the assigned. I carry a lot of guilt that I was willing and deemed unable, while someone that was deemed able, but was not willing, may have died in my place. When I tear up, or get emotional about a military story or soldiers returning home or not, this is a real reason. Guy on a small motorcycle carrying too much cargo was running up the right edge of traffic and met a 2.5 ton, deuce and a half, in the intersection. The cargo truck was making a left-hand turn across the front of the stop traffic from the right. The truck had the right of way. Impact was so extreme, they found one of his shoes more than 100 feet down the road. Saw some guy's entire harvest flattened by a Black Hawk as it came into land. Farmer came out and made noise like he was upset. He got cash for the whole thing and didn't have to harvest or market that season. Ended up smiling like a pig in mud. His wife brought us food. He was our new best friend. I remember field deployments so close to the Korean DMZ that we could hear the loudspeakers blaring all night. We know you are there. We will come and kill you in your sleep and stuff like the Katusas will turn against you. Your Korean friends work for us and will betray you. Alternating Korean and perfect English from dusk until dawn every day for 2 weeks. I was working in an aid station on our remote combat outpost that was an hour helicopter ride from the next high level. A unit had hit an IED while doing route clearance and 2 men had been brought into our aid station. The guy I was working on was dead. His arm was blown off at his shoulder and you could see the blast had even damaged his eyeballs. We didn't have time to move him to another area after we shortly pronounced him deceased. So we basically imitated that we were still working on him to keep his nearby buddy together. His friend was on the other table watching us work on his friend the whole time with a 1,000-yard stare. He looked right through me. The thing that I never shared was that both these guys were wearing a different uniform than what my unit wore. They were American too, but I was more relieved that I was sure I wouldn't know them when I saw them coming into our aid station. Communications Marine here. 2007 Iraq. I was attached to an EOD unit and our base was TQ or Camp Al Taqaddum and our AO was the MSR between Ramadi and Fallujah. In EOD we had 2 teams accompanied by 3 platoons of infantry, 1 attached to each EOD team, and 1 QRF for both teams. During that time, IED and VBID were becoming more and more frequent. We get a call one day, May 15th, that there is live ordnance found in a section right outside of Ramadi. Go out. Sure enough, yellow jugs filled with explosives. EOD Tech Platoon Commander CW02 said something didn't look right with how it was placed. Out in the open, not buried in the road or passageway with a pressure plate. The place it was in the middle of a courtyard surrounded by 3-story buildings on 3 sides. While getting the robot out, the IED exploded, followed by small arms fire from all 3 buildings. Being the COMM Marine, I'm calling in contact on all 3 sides, requesting QRF, air support and calls for fire. After the initial SITREP was sent, I dismounted and began to return fire. That is the last thing I remember, until I woke up with our corpsman dragging me behind cover of the Cougar. After I caught my breath, I got back on the radio to call in a 9 line for a down Marine. While directing the incoming air support to their targets, calling in a 9 line, and helping Doc get the Marine ready for transit, I continued to suppress the enemy. I received the Navy Marine Corps Achievement Medal with Combat Valor. The part no one knows is the reason I blacked out. I got shot in the back. Kabul, Afghanistan. 2011. We were out doing patrol with a Marine team when we heard a bang and everyone started setting up as we thought a bomb went off. I looked to see smoke up the road and proceed to move towards it. I remember my weapon being lighter as the magazine I had was half full because some oil from the trick we were in made my rounds sit funny. I begin swapping out for a fresh one. Snap, clap, ready. Smokes get heavier. I hear screams, but they're drowned out, but grow as I move closer. I turn to see my Marine buddy from the chow hall sobbing in the corner behind the house as his team called in what they were dealing with on the radio. I approach him and ask what happened. Faking bomb man. Took 'em all out bomb? Are any casualties ours? Nah man, they're faking kids. I look up to see that there are indeed body parts strewn out everywhere. It's just their little limbs from a small kid. I hated that day so much. I still think about it. Mine isn't probably what you're looking for, but I'd like to share, because sharing is caring. Deal with it. During one night in basic we had EC monitors, basically fire guards, and everyone takes their turn depending on their bed assignments. During one of my turns, I was doing a routine check of all the living areas. We check the beds, the day room, the latrine, and take accountability of everyone. As I was checking the latrine, I saw someone's boots in one of the stalls. and I usually jokingly ask if they're okay in there because everyone gets constipated during basic. But this time I never got a response. I thought to myself maybe there is something really wrong, so I kept asking questions. I still didn't get any response, so I panicked. My heart pounded thinking someone just killed themselves. Hoping to save someone's life, I knocked open the door. But to my disbelief, no one was there. Boots were gone, and the toilet wasn't a shade. Dorm chief came in, and the other rec monitor came rushing in. I never was scared living in that thing. But from then on one made sure I take my dump while everyone is still awake. I did type this out on Reddit once before, but I haven't told this story anywhere else. I was in the US Army stationed in Maryland. Right off the 295. I was working midnight to 8 AM. I had just got off duty. I sat down in front of my computer and fired up Diablo 2. I flipped on my tiny little TV in my barracks room for background noise. The 300 Club was on. I didn't feel like getting up to change the channel as I was vaping. When the first plane hit, they didn't have video of it happening right away. As soon as I saw the next plane hit the building, I knew we were going to war. I didn't know at the time who the target was going to be. I banged on the barracks room next to mine. I yelled at the guy who also worked nights that we were going to war. He yelled back, "Are we going to war now?" I said I don't think so, to which he replied, "Wake me up when the war starts." He ended up sleeping through 9/11. At first everything was pretty calm. Some of us jumped in the car to go buy a shit ton of smoke in case we got locked down. I think I bought 10 cartons of Newports. I ended up driving like 100 miles an hour as we were in uniform, and if we were stopped the cops wouldn't mess with us. When we got back to base, things got scary, real faking scary. Once the Pentagon got hit, shit got real. They started issuing weapons and live ammo. This is the first time I had ever been given live ammo inside the US. When not at the range point, there were rumors of what to do in case of nukes, moving a percentage of soldiers outside of probable nuclear targets to respond if we ended up getting wiped out. I remember the sounds of jets. My heart stopped for a second until I saw it was a US fighter. I thought it may have been something meaner. The skies were clear for what seemed like an eternity. The fighter came in low and really fast. He then gained some altitude and started circling us. It was a huge relief, but we were still nervously watching for incoming ICBMs. Many of us were told to go to our duty sections. Others were assigned to gates. Before 9/11, most military bases were completely open. You could drive in without issue. We put HMMWV at the gates. Starting off, I don't think they were armed with anything more than M16s, as we didn't have heavy machine guns like the .50 calibers available at that point. They were supposed to ram into anyone coming through the checkpoint. Others that were in little makeshift guard posts would pepper them with small arms. I think the guys on perimeter gates were even issued air horns someone had gone out and bought. Things got scary once again when news of a fourth plane was out there. They evacuated many of the buildings. So many refused to leave. They wanted to continue working. I can't recall if the fighter actually showed up before or after the fourth plane was announced. I have to stop here as I can't really remember the details of what exactly happened next. I think all of us ended up working around 36 plus hours straight. It was all an autopilot blur. Funny side story, I had qualified with the 9mm. All of us that had been issued the M9 pistol, we were allowed to wear it off base even in uniform. Normally we weren't supposed to go off base in BDUs for more than pumping gas or buying smokes. Some of us were encouraged to go off base in groups and shop/eat/whatever in uniform, while armed to help calm the public. People were suddenly amazing to us. We weren't allowed to pay for anything at that point on. No one would take our money or someone else would pay for whatever we were trying to buy. I always insisted to buy my own smokes. Everything went red, white and blue. We ended up as a nation with a thirst for blood and revenge. We didn't care who we were going to bomb. We just wanted to bomb someone. My grandpa's father, my great-grandpa, was an officer who fought for the Polish army in the early stage of World War II. After the Russians invaded, they ended up sending him and his family to a Siberian gulag. Most of my grandpa's family died right there, and I still have a hard time thinking what it must have been like for my grandpa to see that. Luckily when the Nazis declared war on Russia, Stalin let the Poles free, so my grandpa joined Anda's army, a nickname for the Polish army in exile, and walked across Siberia to join up with the British forces in Palestine. He then got sent to fight at Mont Cassino, which was one of the bloodiest battles of WW2. He never really talked about his experiences to my dad or my uncles, and now he has Alzheimer's, so I'll never know, but I can only imagine the horrors he's seen from his country getting invaded, getting sent to a gulag in a frozen wasteland, watching his family work to death, and seeing many of his comrades and friends die in front of him. It must have been hell. Things did get better for him after the war though. He moved to the US and became an engineer, and apparently was one of the engineers for the umbilical tower that was used during the Apollo missions, and he taught the US military and the CIA, I think, Russian, and helped them spy on the Soviet Union.